You can go ahead and do the intro.
Is it actually streaming?
Hmm.
I'm getting a yes on my end, but I'm not. Okay, live now. Beautiful. We'll have to clip this later.
It's fine.
All right, welcome to the Jordan B. Peterson Community Stream, the weekly stream where we go over interesting topics and discussions that are related to the ecosystem around Jordan Peterson. And this week we're going to be watching and commenting on a recent debate that he had with Susan Blackmore. And hopefully we've got a lot of the kinks worked out. We've been playing around with how to get this thing working, and hopefully we'll have a good discussion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it'll be kind of a more casual thing, first time us doing something like this, so hopefully it works out well. All right, you have the video? There you go.
Welcome to the big conversation here on Unbelievable.
Let us know if you guys can't hear anything or if the audio is wrong.
Is a series of shows exploring faith, science, philosophy, and what it means to be human in association with
I'm getting good levels.
Religion, trust.
Right,
Today, our conversation topic is the psychology of belief and do we need God to make sense of life? Well, the big conversation partners I'm sitting down with today are Jordan B. Peterson and Susan Blackmore. Jordan Peterson is a professor of psychology at the University of Toronto and author of the new book, 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos. Jordan rose to prominence in 2016 when his stance on free speech and the threat of legal action for refusing to use transgender pronouns created a media storm. But since then, many new people have discovered his academic work, including a very popular lecture series on the psychology and wisdom of ancient Bible stories. And his new book, 12 Rules for Life, distills much of the wisdom into a guide to leading a meaningful life. Our other guest is Susan Blackmore. She's a psychologist, lecturer, and author of books on consciousness and evolutionary psychology, including The Meme Machine and Seeing Myself, the New Science of Out-of-Body Experiences. And she views many forms of religion as fundamentally negative for human flourishing. She's written, for instance, that religions are an example par excellence of memeplexes that use wicked tricks to ensure their own survival. Well, today we'll be looking at the psychological...
All right, so should we go over that?
Yeah, what do you mean, should we? Do you have some...
Yeah.
Speak on, brother.
Religions fundamentally use meme complexes to for their own survival. I mean, yeah, I guess I go into that a little bit later. What she means by that, so we can.
Yeah, this is just an introduction. The only thing I have
did.
really to comment on is her hair color, and it's not disparaging, let's say, but rather they're adopting, let's say, the human female is now adopting the behavior of a number of other creatures in the world, right? With they've always made themselves up, right? They've always used makeup. They've always nested, so to speak. But the changing of the hair color and they're just broadening their approach to the manner in which they are presenting themselves to the world, right?
Yeah.
It matches her shirt.
I was looking through some of her other discussion or talks that she's had that are up on YouTube, and it's kind of funny to see how her hair color changes throughout each different video, kind of like one of them.
Yeah, you can see that there's like multiple overlapping colors in there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she used to have a whole spectrum of colors for her hair for a while. I don't actually know much about her, but I'm interested in probably the meme machine or what she has to say about memes. That always fascinates me the most when Dawkins talks about that.
Yeah, well, it's like, so there are certain types of people who love words, let's say, love the way that they're used and really latch on to them, and can develop whole theories and identities around them, let's say, like the LGBTQ movement, right? Like the identity is acquired as one acquires the label, and then more identities are acquired as one extends the label. Now with the plus sign at the end. So, but the use of the word meme it's overused. It's definitely overused. Because in the broadest sense, all of our ideas, anything that can be transmitted with speech, is memeable.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, and not just speech, but visual imagery and sounds. All of it's memeable. If it can be transmitted to another person and stored in their head, it's memeable. There's no real there's no real observation here that we haven't noticed since we began using language.
So yeah, it's I guess the distinction is when something that is said or repeated between people or done that is mimicable between people is when that thing kind of takes on a life of its own in a way that spreads like a virus between people. So
yeah, well, you can then talk about a further subsection of the memeable, which is its virulence, let's say. How likely it is to implant itself and then further the idea. So the idea of the meme and the use of the word meme is extremely memeable, right? Everybody loves this word now. Hold on a second.
I wouldn't say everybody. It's kind of, I don't know, with internet culture, I feel like Dawkins needs to come up with a new word, since people have taken it and now it's kind of turned into something different from what it was previously, and now we need to have some sort of better word that, like the archetypes, that has a more, yeah, okay, well, maybe go into the difference between an archetype and a meme exactly. Is an archetype just a collection of memes that kind of formulate together into one specific thing, or an abstraction of specific memes that can still be nested under one archetype?
So I had to step away from the computer.
Oh.
Yeah, about 30 seconds ago.
Oh.
So, my kids are home, so they.
Yeah. Well, we'll actually get into
the last thing I heard
was
that what Dawkins intended originally for it has been transformed.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. But I don't know. That's probably not really relevant. But I also brought up the difference between archetypes and memes, but I think they go into that.
Yes, Peterson goes into that almost right away, I think.
All right, so we can
go
ahead and push play then. Are you on full screen on the stream?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good.
You'll have to start it.
Ready?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Roots of faith beliefs. Can we make our own rules for life, or are we subject to some higher level of meaning? And are even atheists fundamentally religious deep down? I'm really looking forward to today's conversation. So, Susan and Jordan, welcome along to the programme.
Thanks.
Great to have you.
Thank you, Justin.
We'll start with you, Jordan. You're a hard man to categorise in many ways. Your work actually attracts attention from both believers and non-believers. And many of whom say that you've actually made them reconsider their views about religion, especially many atheists that I've heard on, who've said your work opens up things in a new way. Do you just tend to describe yourself as a religious man at all?
I would definitely describe myself as a religious man, yeah. I think that's fundamentally true. The devil's in the details. So what does that mean exactly?
I've seen you've been asked the question, do you believe in God? And that's not a question you necessarily find it terribly easy to answer.
Well, I don't know what people mean when they say believe.
Mm.
Like it's as if that question explains itself when it's asked. It's like it doesn't. What do you mean by believe? What do you mean by God? And what makes you think that the question that I'm answering is the same one that you're asking? This is not something that you can say yes or no to in any straightforward manner. So I find it an off-putting question. And I don't think it's because I'm avoiding the issue. I think that to answer it properly requires books and lectures.
Yeah.
So
Do you see yourself at least in the Christian tradition as far as your, I suppose, worldview?
There's no doubt about that, because I'm a Westerner. There's no escape from that.
Yeah.
I'm conditioned in every cell as a consequence of the Judeo-Christian worldview. And so I've read a fair bit in other religious traditions and have a reasonable grasp on some of them, I would say, not trying to overestimate my knowledge, but we're saturated in Judeo-Christian ethics, and so...
I've seen you say that you certainly live your life as though God exists.
Yes, I would say, well, to the best of my ability. Right, yeah. And I think that that's the fundamental hallmark of belief, is it's how you act, not what you say about what you think you think.
Sure.
What do you know about what you think? Seriously, I mean, we wouldn't need a psychology, an anthropology, a sociology, any of the humanities if our thoughts were transparent to ourselves. They're not in the least.
And you've been
in the least they are, but
you've been willing to be quite critical as well of some of the new atheists, so Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, Richard Dawkins. What have you made of their particular way of approaching
they
religion?
just don't take it seriously enough. As far as I'm concerned, they don't contend with the real thinkers.
All right, we should probably go through some of all that, because the first question is like whether or not you can simply ask and answer, do you believe in God? Because from his way of thinking, belief is what's acted out, as opposed to what you intellectually hold to be, like what proposition you hold to be true or false. Because what we actually hold to be true or not is dependent, from his way of thinking, upon how we're acting out our truth. So there are like certain truths that we're acting out that might contradict what we actually believe in. Are you there? That's all right. Because like what going back to Matt Dillahunty, what is, whether or not he believes in something is whether or not he holds something to be true or not. Like I think that this proposition is accurate and true, thus I believe in it because of that, or I don't believe it because I think it's false. But Peterson is getting at that there's something further than intellectual belief, but something acted out, which is a better...
This is absurd. I'm sorry. Okay.
That's all right. Yeah. So when did you leave?
Well, I wasn't quite gone, but my attention was certainly elsewhere.
Oh, okay.
Yes, this was a great place to pause, and these questions are important because this and okay, so you'll watch what Peterson does here. And first of all, look at his body language. He's guarded. He's beginning this conversation guarded, right?
Mm-hmm.
Look at her. She's attentive, right? She's got her hands clasped gently on her hand. This is really nice. It's good that she's paying attention. And anyhow, when this question is asked, do you believe in God? When it comes from an atheist, or are you religious? It is almost always the case that they're using it as a weapon. Because in the moment that you answer yes, you are then classified as irrational, or someone who believes in the supernatural and therefore incapable of rationally apprehending all these lovely secularist ideas, right? And therefore you are inferior to them. This is almost always the case. And so Peterson is necessarily guarded, right? He's necessarily guarded. And you'll see the way that he constantly tries to readapt his statements to make sure that he can't be attacked. And that's the feeling that he has, and that's the feeling that you have when you're talking with someone like this. And that's a terrible feeling to have when you want to have a good conversation, right? to always be guarded and to feel like you're about to be attacked, or to be thought of as inferior because of your beliefs?
I don't know if it's necessarily from like fear of attack or anything like that. It could be that he's using this verbal ballet to tiptoe around uh, the tiptoe around the language that atheists use that allow them to shut off hearing from people. So if somebody says that they believe in God, then they don't have to listen to them anymore. Or it's not that they don't have to, it's like it stops them from being able to listen to somebody. Like if you were to talk to somebody and they say that they think the earth is flat, something like that, that automatically clouds your judgment for anything else that they're going to be saying. And so he realizes this is something that occurs. And so if he can sidestep that for a while, or try to clarify things in a different way, then people will be able to listen to him from both sides.
Yeah, it's precisely what I'm talking about.
Mm.
That's a consideration.
Like, being afraid of being ousted from a group, where I was talking about it of a little bit more of using language in a way that doesn't oust. Yeah, I guess
that's exactly what I'm talking about. Right. I'm just talking about the emotional valence associated with it, and you're talking more along the lines of the logistics of it, let's say. But this is the debate format. People are contending with their ideas here, and it's not that Peterson is afraid that he's not going to be a part of their group. And I don't think I used the word fear. If I did, I apologize. I don't think Peterson's afraid. He's wary of the manner in which this tactic is used, because it immediately precludes any further conversation, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so he's attempting to maintain his stance that he has a good deal of good points to make, along with all the other good thinkers in the past, regarding the notion of religion and God, and why it's not something that can be so easily dispensed with. Yeah. All right.
So you think that
see, because what happens is what they're doing is they're reducing the entirety of his argument to a single answer to a single question, which then allows them to put a single label upon him. Irrational.
Yeah. Or depending upon which side you're on, then that allows you to either continue listening to him or to stop listening to him.
Right.
Like I see other channels that are atheists, and they're able to kind of latch on to Peterson because they think that he doesn't actually believe in God, but he realizes that the culture of Christianity is kind of the best way for society to thrive.
Right. And I think there's two great examples of this further on in the video that we'll see. One is the type of words that she uses when she talks about Peterson. She uses the word slither, interestingly enough, when he's attempting to sidestep these questions. And she pointedly presses him on whether or not he believes in the miracles of Christ. Right? These are both attempts at defining him as irrational, as someone who believes in silly nonsense and is unworthy of further consideration, and that if they can just get him to say it, then they'll be able to pin it on him. Right? It's a tactic that's been used for a very long time. The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, the famed New Atheist movement. This is a tactic that's used. It's a tactic. It's a rhetorical tactic. It has nothing to do with actual philosophical argumentation. It's ad hominem, so to speak. Right?
All right. Gosh, what was? I guess that was the main. I feel like there was something that we missed also. That was I don't know if I should go back on. That's all right.
Oh, I know all three of them very well, and I have deep, great arguments with them, and they seem to be taking it seriously. I know what you mean. There's a certain sort of superficiality in the writings of all of them, but as people, I find they really care about these issues. Yeah.
Oh, they care. There's no doubt about that, and it's not like
She's finding common ground here. That's
cynical.
nice. She's trying to. You don't have to pause it for all of it. Yeah, just,
Oh,
we can talk over it somewhat.
yeah, she's very gracious in this conversation with Peterson, and of course it is a bias more towards him than really to her. So but I don't know, it feels like they're able to kind of get what they're wanting to say out.
I like her as a person. I just don't think she has any good arguments overall, and I think that's just a problem with the New Atheist movement in general. It's not. Yeah, but I think she was, for the most part, quite charitable and quite agreeable, and was not vicious like many of the other occurrences.
I don't even know if I really consider her quite as much as part of the New Atheist movement, because when she was going into she kind of has a more Eastern philosophy to her, where life is meaningless, but there's still things worth doing. Whereas within, I don't know, the other figures, I see, I don't know if I consider them actually going that far to the east. It seem like the world is very much meaningful, but it's not meaningful because of religion. It's meaningful because of, say, human achievement, maybe.
Well, there's an element of irrationality there that's kind of exposed partly by the interviewer later on there, when she points that out. But we'll get to it, right? So.
Yeah.
Sympathetic to the atheist or rationalist claim. I'm perfectly sympathetic to it, but I don't believe that the level of discussion that's characteristic of Dawkins and Dennett and Sam Harris say approaches the level of complexity of, say, Friedrich Nietzsche or Dostoevsky.
Well, that would be asking quite a lot, wouldn't it?
Yeah, but if you're going to play in that arena, man, you're going to play with the heavyweights.
But what I've noticed is it's a lot of people who maybe up to a point have been interested in what those people have been saying from the New Atheist side, who are also interested in what you're saying. There's an interesting sort of correlation there.
Yeah, definitely.
And why is it that, especially some of these, potentially, I see a lot of men in this audience are coming to you, Jordan, to sort of sit at your feet and hear what you have to say at this point?
Well, the New Atheists have a hell of a time with an active ethic. They say, well, you can build an ethic on rationality. It's like, well, first of all, that's not
Peterson's starting to open up a little bit, moving his hands more. You don't have to pause it. Just make a comment.
By no means self-evident, and their essential existential concept is rather hollow. Like with Harris, for example, when I talked to him twice on 2 different podcasts, and we never really got to his sense of what the ideal society might be. But I've read his writings on the maximization of well-being, for example, and that's just not going anywhere. You can't even measure it properly. And if you're thinking about something like that scientifically, that turns out to be like, that's not a problem. It's a catastrophic problem.
But Sam really goes deeply into the consequences of meditation, and he tells stories about his own experience of how behavior changes. Compassion seems to arise naturally. This is not based on rationality, which is not everything, and I would agree with you there. It's based on practical experience.
Here's a thought. Since with game theory, you can kind of figure out the core ethics that are necessary for a society to prosper or to survive. Would that be an ethic built off of rationality if you just kind of used game theory for your national morality?
Yeah, somewhat. But here's the problem with this. So there's a couple of overlapping concepts that I see here. One of them is the misconstrual that rationality is the same thing as something like deterministic thought, right? Or that rationality is purposefully or entirely contained within logic, let's say. So a truly deterministic thought would be that we could sit down and predict the future behavior of the human race and plot out the best rules, the oughts that they should follow. That's deterministic rationality, let's call it. Whereas retrospective rationality is something like Sam Harrison noting that meditation and cultures that have adopted meditative practices greatly benefit from doing so, right? It's a historical perspective, let's say. He's looking in the past and seeing examples of what has worked. It's just a little bit self-defeating because that's exactly what Jordan Peterson is doing. Exactly. The difference is where they are drawing the line as to what has been good and bad in the past.
Well, I think Harris quite accurately points out all the things that have gone bad within Western religion with the end of faith, which is it's just kind of like a catalog of every bad thing that's ever been done in the name of religion for people to use as kind of an
Well,
just to point back to.
But I think they falsely equate certain outcomes with certain causes, right? So let's like the Spanish Inquisition, right?
Mm-hmm.
Hold on a second.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good point because when comparing, when looking back at all the atrocities done in the name of religion, I think it's only fair to look at also to the atrocities that were occurring just in that time. So, like, if every kind of society in the world was used to a slave ethic, and Christianity also was part of that slave ethic. You can't compare Christianity at that time to the morality of secular societies now. In order to at least act in good faith, you would have to compare the Christian society to the other societies at that point in time.
Well, okay.
Or
so let me get back to the point I was trying to make. My kids are adorable, but they're anyhow. The Spanish Inquisition, or take anything similar to it, right? There are behaviors and outcomes towards certain attitudes that any one of us, as you were saying, can look back from our current moral standpoint and say are reprehensible, right? But to point their origin within the source or within the religion itself is making a misattribution. Because let's say, let's stick within the Christian faith. The behavior of someone who is torturing someone else is antithetical to the stated goals of that religion. And therefore there's an opposition within the behavior and the rule structure that's setting up the odds. So you can't necessarily create this strict one-to-one correspondence between the religion existing and the behavior that it produces as though it's the cause of all behavior.
Well, you can look to the behavior and then look to where in the rule structure that allows for that type of behavior to occur, and then kind of conclude. So if you're looking like to the Old Testament when they're within a much more harsher environment and the types of actions that were carried out in the name of religion, and then follow that thread all the way back to, say, the Spanish Inquisition, and then see the correlations, then you can assume that their religion allows for that type of action to occur.
You can assume, but the further you go back, the less likely you are seeing the true perspective, let's say, because it's another criticism that they make, that it's all hooey anyways, right? That you can't trust anything that's written in the Old Testament, let's say. Certainly not the supernatural aspects of it. So when God tells Israel to go slaughter a whole nation of people, that's terrible, right? That's God being used as a justification for killing, let's say. But if you're throwing out the validity of everything, how are you drawing any conclusions from it in the first place? It's begging the question.
Well, you're throwing it out, but you're recognizing that the people that are acting in the name of religion aren't throwing it out, and so they're using religion as their...
Well, no, this is another aspect of it. So I'm not throwing it out. If you assume that God doesn't exist, then anyone who says he does exist and then behaves reprehensibly clearly is using that as a justification.
Yeah, but the book itself exists.
No, but the conclusion that God does not exist is assumed within it beforehand. That's begging the question.
For the people that rely upon the book for their moral ethic.
No, at the time of the reprehensible behavior. So if God does exist and he truly did tell someone to go kill an entire nation of people, who the hell is Sam Harris to judge that? Right?
Okay, so Sam Harris is judging it based off the conception that God doesn't exist.
Right.
And so they were just acting out from their own desires.
It's assuming the conclusion within the initial premise. And the other aspect of it is the misallocation of behavior to a whole schema of oughts, right? Because thou shalt not commit murder, right? And to treat your neighbor as yourself, and all of this combines into a certain kind of system of oughts. Yeah, so it's very difficult to disentangle, say, the whole moral perspective at any given moment. And it's certainly very difficult to do it if you are assuming from the start that you are right, that there is no God, and it's all irrational hooey in the first place.
Well, I think you could still look at it from an agnostic perspective, like whether there is or isn't a God. You can judge people's actions based off of their behavior and what led them to that behavior.
Yeah, well, that's what they're doing. The argument is over whether or not it's being done properly, whether or not the conclusions that are being drawn are appropriate.
Mm-hmm.
You can do it. We always do it. We do it in our day-to-day activities. We look at someone, we see the way they behave, and we immediately make an assumption, or a whole nest of assumptions. We say that their behavior was not appropriate. And that's, it's a difficult game to play.
All right. I wanted to bring up also, I don't know if Sam Harris is necessarily using the past history of meditation to justify the act of meditation, but he talks about how when he goes through his meditation, he gets insights into how we should behave morally, because like there is no self, there's no need to treat yourself as superior to anyone else's self or lack of self, whoever they are as a person. We're all equal. So that's a non-religious it's not using God to determine equality among people. So that's a justification that he came to drive his rational ethical system without using like the the image of God within man, but instead just man exists and each man is equivalent to the other man.
Well, he's picking and choosing. And he's not only using the historical perspective, you're right, he's also using the personal. So his own use of meditation has brought him good, therefore it is good. And this is always kind of the two contradictory views within the atheistic mindset, it seems. It's the picking and choosing of the best of whatever, as opposed to all of the bad things that have ever happened. And from their current stance, they can do that. They can look at all the bad things that have ever happened and dismiss them and their origins and how they're tying them together, and to keep all the things that they call good.
Mm-hmm. Plus, if you like look to Jonathan Haidt or Friedrich Nietzsche, also they talk about how people's ethical systems aren't based upon their rationality, but their sense of values prior to that. So it may be that Sam Harris, raised within a Judeo-Christian ethic, left out God and then tried to figure out how to rationally come back to the same types of ethics, which is kind of like also I think what Kant did quite a bit, trying to work out a secular ethical system, and then kind of because of that also needing to include God in the mix, just so that the reason for going on this ethical system was there. But I don't entirely know exactly all of Kant. There's quite a bit to what he's done.
Kant. Yeah. Well, so yeah, going into the categorical imperative and the way that Kant developed.
This probably off topic.
Yeah,
really,
yeah.
It's being raised within a Western society. You have a automatic sense of value for the individual,
right?
Like whereas if you were raised in it, say probably India, and still meditated every single day, you might have been raised to have a stronger sense of value towards respect for authority, and less of a respect for individual cases, like, and maybe even less of a respect for the feminine, or not to pick on India, just one of those other types of societies. There's going to be a different sense of ethics
India
there.
is interesting. They're actually pretty interesting because I think initially they had a much higher respect for the feminine form. If you look at the origins of the religion, you look at the temples that they have constructed from the past, but the influence of Muslims, let's say, has had a profound impact on their culture after the Muslim era.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that's neither here nor there. And Peterson's argument is exactly it's the same as Harris's observation, let's say. Harrison is observing the world, and he's picking and choosing the best. And he's saying, I don't need God to activate these ideas. And that in the inclusion of God and the inclusion of these religions negatively affects people's behavior. But it's just begging the question, right? That there's almost certainly an evolution of ideas and memes in the same way that there's evolution of biological life. And they get into this later, the meme gene complex, right? So maybe we should press play. Oh man, I'm stuck looking at her. Oh, there's some tweeting coming through.
Oh, what happened?
Her necklace is really distracting me at the moment. That thing is huge.
Yeah, anyway. Continue. You were saying there's a series of memes out there.
Oh, no, I was saying that they get into this discussion of the meme gene complex, the interaction that occurs between memes and genes.
Yeah.
And so I'll probably bring it up when they get there.
Yeah. So Peterson brings up that just by being raised in this society, he was raised with a Judeo-Christian ethic.
Mm-hmm. It's in every cell, he says.
And even there's the assumption that there also that even being raised secularly, you'll have the same type of ethic that occurs. Because I think like Sam Harris, he wasn't even had a religious upbringing, but I'm not sure about that exactly. But there have been other people that have been raised within a secular upbringing. But do they still carry the same Judeo-Christian ethic within them?
Yeah,
there's
yeah.
still
Well, the laws.
there's still that.
All right.
Well, not just the laws. There's still the value for individual freedom and autonomy. That's something very much Western.
Right. Yeah, that's what I mean. The laws, the social structure, the culture, all of it is founded upon religion. Right? All of it. Every bit of it. There was no non-religious, let's say, founding prior to this kind of new atheist movement.
Hmm. So let's imagine a kind of like a Theseus ship where it starts off being grounded in God, and then over time it becomes more and more secular, having rational reasons without needing the God character in place, to the point where you can kind of change out everything from what it was previously into something that is purely based around this
Yeah, well,
rational now that we've created.
Let me fix what I just said because it's not true. So the first development of societies that were attempting to be purely secular, let's say, were the societies that Peterson has greatly railed against, right? The development of the atheistic USSR or China and their attempts to completely oust those elements from their culture and the catastrophic results of that.
Yeah, but then there's the other societies that have it kind of naturally grow into, like, work its way into the secular system, like Sweden. The term Christian just is equivalent to being a good person, like nothing to do with going to church or being religious or anything like that. He's like a good Christian Swede, means he's just a good person. There's nothing tied to religion in those cases, or
Well,
it
yeah, so
they've lost their religious aspect.
But Peterson's argument is that they haven't, and I agree with him. They haven't lost it. All they're doing is saying a phrase, "I don't believe in God." Right? And this is almost always because the cultural milieu, the atmosphere is such that if you say you believe in God, you are now considered a rube.
Mm-hmm. It's not just saying that they don't believe in God. It's them intellectually thinking that they do not believe in God and feeling that they do not believe in God. Like she talks about, she has a sense of gratitude, but she doesn't have it towards any being. She has it just to the entire universe.
Yeah, and how does that differ, let's say, from the conceptualization of God that Peterson has?
Or, well, we don't know how Peterson conceptualizes God either.
We've got a good idea. I mean, you and I do. Maybe the people watching don't, but
well, that's the thing. Other people watch Peterson and they assume he's like a naturalist atheist. So it may be that we're both looking at Peterson from different filters and unable to determine whether or not where he actually is.
They're using words in a particular way. So you can't. So even though you use the phrase naturalist atheist, or an atheist claims that, you still can't say, and this is Peterson's argument, you still can't say that they actually disbelieve in what a God is and the God that is, say, driving this universe and driving morals and how important it is for that discussion. And this is another aspect of it that Harris never really attempts to meet, let's say, is it has to be, all of this has to exist at a resolution that, let's say, a significant majority of your population can apprehend. And that this is never really discussed, right? Like Harris and his particular position in society and all of the benefits that he's gained from the structure of society and all the people around him that believed in it, has been able to discard the idea and track his progress through academic circles and shaking the hands of all the people around him, and has had plenty of time and desire and ability to access all these ideas in a particular way, sans God. But how many people can really do that? I mean, even if we grant him the idea that he's truly not believing in God and that his words are meaningful in that respect, how many people can do that?
I don't think that's even really relevant, because what Peterson's trying to do is to say that even the people that proclaim that they don't believe in God and feel that they don't believe in God, they're all not even really atheists, because they're still behaving like they do believe in God.
Yeah, that's part of it. I'm making another assessment that even if we assume that to be true, even if we assume that Harris truly believes in no God and that he's capable of navigating the world with that belief, how many other people are able to do that? Is that universally applicable? To go back to Kant, is that a categorical imperative?
It could be, because people are able to change their beliefs well, not quite easily, but it is possible for people to have a certain belief and then to have it changed. So within Jonathan Haidt's book, he talks about how we have our moral reasoning that occurs after the fact. Like, we have our certain sense of morality within us that we're either brought up with or raised with, or we've gotten it from other people that have been able to articulate it in a way that makes us believe in it. And then we have our reasoning that we use to try to share why we act in the way that we do, or why we believe the things that we do. So, and there's been tests to like bring up things that contradict their moral sense, and then they'll give you a reason for why that's wrong to them, and then the person can like point out how that's flawed, and then they'll have to come up with a different reason for why that feels wrong. So it's at least most people. Maybe there are some people that have the moral reasoning that then changes how they actually feel, or like a person's moral sense is derived purely from rational reasonings that he didn't get to a priori.
Well, let me give you a concrete example. Guy with an 80 IQ, temperament highly conscientious, temperament very low openness. Right? Now apply Sam Harris's rational human secularism to that individual.
Okay, well, I don't even think we need to be doing that, because like as society evolves, that person may not be within a society like 50 years in the future, or 100 years in the future, or I don't know. I think we should be sticking more to the people that actually have their rational reasons for not believing in God.
Well,
because I think probably like people like Dan Dennett, they talk about how religion is useful for a lot of people, and people like Matt Dillahunty, they see the utility, but they want to create a new narrative that anybody can rely upon for their foundational beliefs.
Right, and that's what I'm questioning. Is that possible? And you can't just say that those people won't exist in the future, because the bell curve, as far as we know, is like a fundamental aspect of nature itself, the way that things are normally distributed. So if the complexity of society is continually increasing, and the complexity of the kind of utilitarian rationalistic arguments that are necessary to be made in the moral landscape of a secularist environment, it is truly okay to ask the question, is this something that is of sufficient resolution that anyone or a good majority of the people can access it and then use it in their environment?
I'd say the answer is probably yes, because at least from their perspective, the narrative that drove their beliefs had no grounding in supernatural reality. And so if those belief systems were able to be widespread enough to all people, then a different set of belief systems that had no driving from supernatural reality could be able to be widespread within everyone.
How are you drawing the connection there?
Okay, so from the naturalist perspective, the Bible evolved over a period of time, and people have been able to use that as their sense of morality, just without a God playing any part in it. And so you could do the same thing, just with a different story structure. Or maybe you could adapt the current story structure into a way that fits within the secular humanist desire now, and then use that to be widespread among all the people.
Oh, you are, but you're not addressing the central claim that they can dispense with God. You're just saying that various stories have existed and do exist.
Yeah, and are able to be adopted as a universal ethic, or not universal, at least national ethic, and then global ethic, or not quite global, but a widespread ethic.
Mm-hmm. Well, so what we're trying to do, essentially, is discuss what are the characteristics of a good system of oughts. Now, religion is the historical observation of those systems of oughts. We have various types of religions throughout the history of the world. Every single human culture has had one. Every single one. And so historically, looking at it, that's what we see. And now someone's coming along and saying, we don't need that anymore. And that's our question. Are they right about it? Are they right about removing that characteristic?
Okay.
So all right, let's press play and keep going. We're gonna get stuck here.
Yeah, you're right.
Training in observing one's own thoughts, which is also of interest to you, and in the way behavior changes in ways which he would say, and also query whether it's true, that it's better behavior.
Well,
that being compassionate and kind to people is better. We can't have some great underlying reason why. If you don't have God, it's a very, very difficult question. You've got to find some basis. But even without one, Sam is trying to say, as I would, that if you spend a lot of time meditating and really becoming to understand yourself and see the consequences of certain thoughts and actions, then better actions follow.
All right.
That's one of the...
Can you pause? I don't think
so
I
you
can
can, you can find certain moral ethics to be true without...
Right. Now, no, listen to what she's
finding
saying, though.
God to be true.
Listen to what she's saying, though. If you meditate, and if you think about these things, and if you do this, these are the oughts. She's making a new system of oughts. Okay? These are the oughts. If you do these oughts, you can come to these same conclusions that I did. And I'm saying there are a significant number of people in the world that will never find what she just described as capable of producing the results that she is achieving.
Oh yeah, probably, because people will be brought up in different ethical societies, and so they'll
not just that. I mean, temperament and intellect. Those two things matter a great deal, right? Remember Nietzsche's observation. She's a philosopher. Listen to what she's saying in her underlying biological substrate.
But you could still have somebody like the Dalai Lama that does all the meditating for you and then produces the list of oughts without having God. I don't know. Somebody like the Dalai Lama. You could have Sam Harris create the Bible 3.0 that completely removes God from the picture and has all the necessary oughts within it.
Well, I would say you're absolutely right. They have developed a new religion. Sam Harris is part of a new religion, the atheistic religion. I think it's described that way. All right, that it meets those characteristics.
Yeah.
But at the same time, they're saying that shouldn't be necessary, and that any particular individual.
No. They're saying that the belief in the supernatural shouldn't be necessary.
They're saying more than that.
A universal ethic is necessary, but they're their classification of what is religious is belief in a supernatural. They're not using Peterson's use of religious, remember. So, the belief in a supernatural is unnecessary, but the need for a universal ethic is definitely necessary. And so
that depends a great deal on how you're defining supernatural and how you're defining God.
Mm-hmm.
And this really boils down to internal versus external localization of control. I think that's really what it boils down to. The system of oughts and the behavior that you experience as a child determines a great deal about how you feel towards that system of oughts. I brought this up before a number of times that a lot of these new atheist types were raised with a particular Christian ethic and have a handful of stories that have produced trauma in their childhood. Many of them say, because they're intelligent individuals, moments where they realize that the person who's speaking to them is irrational and that they don't want to be seen that way. And they explicitly state this. So it often has less to do with, say, the supreme ideas that they're espousing, that the supernatural is some hooey that prevents us from progressing, and more to do with what they've experienced within their own lives.
Sure, you can say that about the religious too, though. I mean, people are flock towards religion because of how fucked up their life has been without it.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so there is the ability to create a universal... Okay, well, there's the attempt being made to create a new ethic without God. That you said yourself, Harris and people like him are attempting to do, and at least partially successfully. I mean, there's a whole flock of the new atheist crowd that have been using these books written by these people to drive their new ethic.
Have they?
I know at least some.
Have you ever spent any significant time in the atheist community?
People say that they use, like, when asked, like, what is your moral system, and then they'll say the moral landscape. Like, I use the moral landscape as what how to act in the world, essentially, or how to treat people. So even though I haven't read it, there's at least the people that have that use that to justify their moral actions. Or not justify, but as their supposed basis for their actions.
Right. Well, anecdotally.
And then Peterson, and then Peterson brings up how even though it is something new, it's something that was driven from a Judeo-Christian ethic prior to that, just by being raised in a Western society.
Well, it's not just that. I would say that from a broader perspective, the percentage of people who have attempted to adopt these ideas and yet still act successfully in the world is dramatically lower than the people like Sam Harris would like you to believe. And that is precisely why Peterson is now rising to fame. Because every one of those people were attempting to adopt Sam Harris's ideas, and they weren't working. And that's why Peterson has now resurged to fame. It's an adaptive response to this attempt to destroy a greater meaning.
I don't know about that. I mean, I'm sure there's plenty of people that have been able to successfully use Sam Harrison's moral ethic, as well as probably their own meditation and things like that, in order to discover morality for themselves. And that's the thing that they work off of.
Well, but Sam Harris didn't discover his morality for himself.
He didn't?
No. That's Peterson's argument.
Yeah. That's Peterson's argument. But to Sam Harris, he feels that he discovered it for himself.
Oh, it doesn't matter what he feels himself. He's picking and choosing from the past behaviors of other people, the best ideas.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't get it from himself.
Well, he's the one picking. Well, I know that kind of goes against his sense of self, but the person that calls himself Sam Harris, that's the person that did the picking and choosing to find the right things that worked and the wrong things that didn't.
Right. He's doing at an individual level what entire populations of people have done in the past. And he's doing it from the most recent, leading edge perspective. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like, anyhow, we are going to get stuck here forever. So we gotta keep going. We gotta let him talk.
All right. Yep.
Things I like about his work.
Well, and I'm certainly not questioning his ethical integrity or his commitment to these problems. Although I certainly don't think that compassion or kindness constitutes a sufficient grounds for a transcendent ethic.
Exactly.
Not in the least.
It's temperamental.
Partly because both, and I can speak about that technically to some degree. Compassion is associated with trait agreeableness fundamentally, and agreeableness is a great short-term strategy for infants, but it's a very bad medium to long-term strategy for adults, and it's by no means the ground upon which an entire complex society can rest. And that's partly what you see playing out right now in the political world, because the politically correct types are very high in compassion. We have research that demonstrates that. And so, but that ethic doesn't work for a sophisticated society.
We were only doing introductions. We're already well into the...
It's my fault. I started. I interrupted.
But let's come to you, Sue. You may be familiar to some unbelievable listeners who have already heard you on the show before. I think you're happy to describe yourself as an atheist. Does that mean for you that you are a naturalist, someone who's committed to a view that our experiences can be fully explained by a purely material world?
No. I mean, I sign up in a way to naturalism groups and beliefs, but because I work on consciousness such a lot, and the problem of how do we relate the mind-body problem, here's this table, here's my glass of water, we'll agree that if I go like this, it'll go all over the place.
And ruin the microphone.
How does that relate to the taste of the water? These fundamental problems mean I have big queries about naturalism as you described it there.
Okay.
In a much broader sense, yes. As you know, and many listeners will know, I started out being a parapsychologist and rejected ideas of clairvoyance and telepathy and ghosts and poltergeists because of lack of evidence. So that's one way to naturalism, to throw that lot out. I was brought up like you as a Christian, and I threw that out because in the end it didn't make sense to me. So that's another.
All right. So can you throw out the Judeo-Christian ethic that you've been brought up with? Can you get rid of it?
Teach an old dog new tricks? I don't know. That's the whole argument.
Can you change your own morals?
Well, so here's what happens, and that's what I meant. There you go. So she was a parapsychologist, and in her head, that research, that belief system, inhabits the same space, let's say, as the Christian God, essentially, because both of them ended up being nonsensical to her for various reasons. But
I don't know, just improvable, which is usually the atheist rationale for not believing in God.
I'm using her language. She just said it didn't make sense to her. Right, and then that led her down a further road. Maybe she didn't dispense with God right away. Perhaps she had to come across Daniel Dennett first, or Sam Harris first, or Dawkins first. Darwin, the same thing, essentially. This is how many people view Darwin, that he, in the development of evolution, provided a space for atheists to exist.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so... All right, let's let him keep going. We go.
Well, that I wanted to bring my main point was, can you get rid of the social ethic that you were brought up in? Yeah. I mean, Peterson brings us up later with Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment. That it was somebody that was able to kind of separate his own biology out from or not his own biology, his own upbringing and the ethics that he was brought up with, to get rid of them and to act against them. Because that's the thing, you can always act against your own. Like, I know it would be better for me to eat this salad than to eat this piece of cake, and I still eat the piece of cake. That's me working against my own ethic.
Or misstating your ethic. It could just easily be that the words that you spoke to yourself were misstated. Right? I think the way
I don't
that
understand.
Okay, so you said to yourself, I should eat this healthy food rather than this junk food. Those are words spoken in your mind, and yet you enacted a different behavior. So if you were to give words to the part of you that chose the behavior, they would be saying, I should eat this junk food rather than the cake. You see? And this is essentially the same thing that Peterson is remarking about the statement, I don't believe in God. If you could give words to your behavior that are enacted differently than the words that you state explicitly, what would they be saying?
So
you have a neocortex. You have a few Brodmann's areas associated on the left-hand side of your head that have to do with language construction and the words that you choose and the meaning that they have, right? And so you associate your ethic with those sequences of words, and yet I would say your ethic is associated with your behavior, not your words. And that's what Peterson would say.
I could see people. Okay, so how does Sam Harris's behavior say that he believes in God? How do you get to that?
I don't necessarily force that point, but I would say that you pick and choose what you believe, let's say, by mostly letting drop a handful of things and retaining everything else. And that it's a point that Peterson's about to make later on about Raskolnikov, and that most people don't choose these things because they're a coward. And he uses, it's really funny, the kind of pointed language he uses with this lady, but, and you know, he's saying that it's compassion is the moral ethic of an infant, right? So to work with infants.
All right.
Yeah, let's let him keep going.
A way to say I'm left with naturalism, but I'm not left with a naturalism that explains everything. I'm left with a feeling that that's what I want to try to do, to understand what's going on here in minds, in bodies, in tables and glasses of water, and it's very difficult.
You're well known for picking up the idea of memes that sort of originated at some level with Richard Dawkins, the idea of an idea propagated across generations. And you even went as far as to describe religion as a virus of the mind in terms of its
that was Richard's term, but yes, okay.
Is that a kind of view you would still stand by today?
Yes, but you've got to be careful about what you mean by a virus. I mean, I think if I often say in lectures, imagine a continuum between what you mean as being a virus of the mind. It's really bad. You know, it's like a flu virus or
usually
AIDS
we
or
think
something.
of a virus in negative terms.
And yes, and they aren't always. So imagine that you think, you know, religions is utterly bad, or you think religion's utterly wonderful and utterly good, and all in between. I think Richard is way down there, and I'm somewhere here. I think by and large, on balance, the world would be a better place without any religions. But
see, the problem is clumping all religions together, because, like, do we consider secular humanism as a religion or not?
Yeah, of course. I do. And Sam Harris doesn't either clump them together. Like, he's currently actively engaged in, say, the amelioration of the Muslim problem. And
yeah, that's the worst or the most prominent problem with religion.
Right. And he frequently explicitly states that he sees a vast difference between say, Muslim behavior and Christian behavior.
So what is the title of this? It's like, can the free world, what was it? Something, can the world do without God? Like, can you live a good life without God, or something like that? But there's always the kind of desire to bring up the question, like, is religion good or bad, when there's a wide spectrum of religions. And so if you're putting all religions are a mind virus, does that include secular humanism in it or not? Does that include any meme that can be propagated through people? Does that count as religion because it's something immaterial and well, not necessarily. Okay, so yeah, let's what is the difference between
let me
Sorry.
pose a question, a thought experiment, let's say, something to keep in our minds as we're going through the rest of this. It's frequently the case that the negative oughts are discussed, thou shalt not. But I think far more important are the positive benefits gained from a belief in God. And I will contrast this with, say, I'll contrast two points of view. There's the person who is struggling to achieve something, and if they only believe in themselves and what they're capable of, they will look within and they will test themselves according to whatever the criteria are, and if they fail, if they see that they're failing, that's it. Versus another person who looks within themselves, sees the failing, and then appeals to a higher power. Now, this is a very real psychological process, and it's akin to something like, there's this lovely little example, this little test where you can draw a mark on a wall as high as someone can reach, let's say. And you draw that mark and then have them reach again, and it almost always the case they can reach higher once they see where that mark is. It's something kind of like that.
I can understand that for sure, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the higher power is equivalent to God, because you could say that the higher power is the genes within you of people that have come before.
I'm not going there yet. What I'm simply stating is that there is a difference in behavior and action associated with the belief itself, and that's what we're questioning here. These two individuals are questioning: is the belief necessary?
Belief in God.
In God. Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
The religions would not thrive if they didn't have within them things which are positive. I mean, we know at a personal level, at a society level, the worst societies are more religious. At a personal level, there's evidence that people are happier and they have better social connections and so on if they're religious. So I don't think we would be stuck with these horrible memes if it weren't.
I think
I think they're about to go into it, though,
yeah. Was it Norway? It is, compared to all other countries, is the happiest country, and it's also the least religious, something like that.
Yeah, that's
the fact that they also have some good qualities.
What do you make of the whole meme theory and the fact that Sue does feel ultimately...
I think it's a shallow derivation of the idea of archetype, and that Dawkins would do well to read some Jung. In fact, if he thought farther and wasn't as blinded by his a priori stance about religion, he would have found that the deeper explanation of meme is in fact archetype.
I disagree. I mean,
Can you just first of all explain archetypes for those who are not perhaps familiar with that particular psychological...
Well, an archetype...
physical deformity on her right hand. I just noticed that. She has like 2 fingers that are some kind of congenital malformation. I feel so much connected with her now that... Okay.
Yeah.
Behavior that's grounded in biology. So it's the behavior itself. So you could think about that as both the instinct and the manifestation of that instinct, but it's also the representation of that pattern. So part of what's coded in our mythological stories, for example, are images of typical patterns of behavior. And those are the typical patterns of behavior that make us human. I really want to have this discussion about memes, by the way, because...
All right, so a meme is something that propagates through thought, and an archetype is something that propagates through action and thought.
Yeah, well, so a meme, let's say, is the software, and you can write any piece of software in a particular bit of code, let's say, whereas an archetype is more like the conjunction of the hardware and the software, where the hardware necessarily shapes the way the software is encoded.
Right? Yeah, okay, and that brings up to what I was talking about earlier about genes, memes affecting genes and vice versa.
Because it's really a discussion that needs to be had. Because I think that the meme idea is very interesting, and I do think that there are contagious ideas, but that needs to be chased down much deeper, because there are ideas that are so contagious that we've actually adapted to them biologically. And once that happens, they're no longer merely memes. They're something else. They're built into us. I can give you
these archetypes, as you described.
Yeah, well, I can give you a kind of example of that. So imagine, I'll have to try to do this relatively rapidly. It's very complicated, so I'm hoping I can do it. So imagine that we live in dominance hierarchies. We don't have to imagine that. That happens to be the case. They're at least 350 million years old. So they're really, really old. So the idea of the archetype of dominance is older than our ability to perceive trees, right? It's really down there, and our nervous system is fully adapted to the existence of dominance hierarchies. It's one of the things the serotonergic system tracks. Okay, so now we also know that your position in a dominance hierarchy, especially if you're male, is proportionate to your reproductive success. The higher you up in the hierarchy, the more likely you are to succeed. Okay, so what that means is that males have been selected for their ability to move up a dominance hierarchy, but that's not quite right. They've been selected for their ability to move up the set of all possible dominance hierarchies. And that's a very abstract set. And there's a set of characteristics that go along with the ability to move up the set of all possible dominance hierarchies that's represented in religious terms as the optimal ethical manner in which to conduct yourself.
I see.
And that's not a meme that's casually passed from person to person. It's way deeper than that.
I think you're being unfair to memes. I would make this response here about the difference between memes and archetypes. So archetypes are there whether we have memes or not. All of that history of evolution is there.
Yes.
So we have, ideas about sex differences or ideas about dominance is a very good example that don't require memes. They can then become memes. And a meme by definition...
Yeah.
I can try to... I think it's just going to keep doing that pause play thing when it's in full screen, though. All right. So 2 points. She's having to defend her bread and butter, the meme association. That's what she's famous for, right? Being unfair to memes. And I don't know if I agree with what they just both agreed on, that the archetypes are there without the memes. I think it's a union of the underlying biological substrate and a type of imprinting on top of it, the software imprinting. And I think the counter to this agreement exists in the feral children, right? If you take a human that has the underlying biological substrate and stick them where they have no access to any of the memes, they don't come out with the archetypes. It doesn't seem to happen. They can't function in society. They can't function in anything, really. So there's something else going on there. Like, it has to be shaped where it becomes malformed. And it has to be shaped by, say, the memes of your species, whatever they may be. It's probably true for a number of... like we see the same kind of thing happen with domesticated and or captive animals. Their behavior changes. It's not as adaptive. But yeah, not a strong point, just my area of disagreement there.
Okay. Oh.
Definition, as Dawkins started it out, is that which is imitated, or that which is copied from person to person. So the idea of dominance hierarchies can be a meme, and all the ideas we build on top of that, as long as we pass it from person to person. Now,
we could certainly think of hierarchies of memes from
yes, indeed,
from ones that are no more than fads that wash across the culture to ones that are permanent and enduring.
But you were kind of trivializing memes, and I think the power of the idea of memes is this: we have the first replicator, genes on the planet, and we know the consequences of that, producing all these organisms. But the idea about memes is that they are a second replicator. So genes are copied by chemical processes in bodies. Memes are copied by imitation and other kinds of interactions between human beings, and very little in any other species at all. And that's what gives rise to culture. So the whole theory about memes is one of many ways of trying to understand the evolution of culture. And in that way, I say it's not trivial
quick
at all.
response, and I want to move on to talking about the 12 rules, Jordan.
Well, the issue is what happens when a meme is so widely distributed that it becomes a determining factor in evolution itself, because it translates.
Meme gene co-interaction.
Yes, exactly. Well, see, that's where I think. Well, that's where I think the religious. For me, that's the grounds of the essential religious instinct. It's a meme gene interaction, and it goes back forever.
Yes.
And then and I'll finish with this. See, because once you see that there's a meme gene interaction and that there's selection in favor of a certain meme, let's say, then you open up the entire question of what constitutes the underlying reality. Because, see, this is something I tried to have.
I'm wondering just how important the gene aspect is to, I guess the archetypes, but I don't know. I've been thinking of it in regards to our morality, such as like if you were to bring somebody, a child from, say, the Middle East, and then raise them in a Western society, they would take on would they take on the Western culture memes? Well, definitely the memes, but would they take on the morality? Would they have the same intuitive sense for right and wrong as the people brought up in this culture, or would they have something different? Be like a commingling between the two. I'd assume it would be somewhat blank slate, that at least in regards to the cultural upbringing.
Well, so I think so genes are information recording devices. That's all they are. They record information about how to construct proteins.
Yep.
and the profound complexity that arises from that, regardless of that complexity, that's what they're doing. They're recording how to enact behavior in the world, which is what proteins are doing. They're behaving in a certain way. They're configuring in a certain way. They're combining in certain ways. It's all behavior, right? The highest level, we have these incredible abstractions, but they're the pinnacle of this recording of how to behave. And our morality, as expressed in terms of words and the way that we inscribe certain marks on pages in stone, etc., is just an expression, the highest, most abstract form of that exact expression. So, to further refine it a bit, genes are what they seem to be, is concerned with how to facilitate cooperative action within a certain boundary. And depending on how the genes propagate, that can be something as simple as a single individual organism cooperating with its cellular structure together to create an organism, or socially communal, right? And just goes up and up and up.
Yeah, so you can see DNA is kind of like the ethical system for how to create a human. And then you can see memes as or religion as the ethical system for how to form a meta-organism, or like a society.
Yes, right. It's a more inclusive gathering, right? It's the communal behavior. Yep.
So yeah, I think you could create a new meta-organism without using the well, I don't know if you can go without using the religious language, because our religious language is built off of what we are as genetic creatures. Like it's tied to our biology, like having a father and a mother and a child. These are the three kind of fundamental truths to how we live. And so religion would be based off of that. But could you create a system? Yeah, I imagine you could create a system without, well, no, it would still be using the biological foundational truths, just without the extraneous supernatural mumbo jumbo, as they would put it. I definitely see that we don't have that currently, and I can't exactly imagine how successful it would work without the more supernatural elements to it, because if your limitation of action is based upon the material, then anytime the material creates the scenario where, or not material, but the environment, whenever the environment allows for you to get away with something, I don't know.
Well, supernatural, again, the weirdness of supernatural is the weirdness in the different way in which it's used. Okay, so there are at least 3 different ways to view it, I think. One, there is the necessity of trying to understand the ontological arguments for the existence of God. If motion exists and you don't want to end up with an infinite regress, you have to have a first mover unmoved, let's say.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's ontologically the supernatural. It's something that exists outside of nature. Then you have the way of defining supernatural as this kind of hooey idea, right? Of spirits and ghosts and underlying mechanisms that exist that people can't see yet are real. Now, there's usefulness in that supernatural hooey, let's say, and you can define that, I guess, in the same way that Brett Weinstein did, that the usefulness of the idea that the porcupine can't shoot its quills, right? Or you claim that it does, but it can't. That truth value is, let's say, supernatural. It doesn't exist. It's something outside of nature. The truth of it, shooting the quills, and yet it's still functionally useful. Then you have another view of supernatural, which is the view that I have, which is just that, or the view that I use it, the way that I use it most often is that which is yet to be explained, right? That you can experience something that is phenomenal. It's a phenomenal experience and has no explanation, right? And that will always exist. We learned from, let's say, Gödel and Tarski's development of how we seek truth and how axiomatic systems develop truth. That seems to be a fundamental quality of our universe. That there's something that will always exist outside of your current explanatory power, and yet you can seek it and find it. It's a really deep idea that never gets discussed in these conversations, and it should be.
Well, I mean, from the more naturalist viewpoint, there are a system of laws and limitations to the universe that only allow for certain types of actions to occur. And so miracles can't exist because they would go against the fundamental laws of nature. But of course, that requires a axiomatic presupposition that the universe behaves according to these laws continually and across time, even though that itself isn't something observable.
Right. That and using the word miracle, right? It's not necessarily the case that, supernatural, just that which is unexplained. Miracle can be used in a slightly different way, but...
Yeah, like David Hume, he uses miracle as that which goes against that which breaks the fundamental laws of nature.
Which we have no access
close to that.
Which we have no access to whatsoever, right? It has to be assumed as an axiom.
All right, let's continue.
Have a talk with about Sam Harris, and we augured in very rapidly. You could say that reality is that which selects. Now, it's not exactly a materialist viewpoint. It's more of an evolutionary viewpoint. And if reality is that which selects, then what's selected by that reality is in some sense correct. Now that's not, well, this is why
yeah, you're adding on I mean, that's a big claim you're adding on
I
there.
know it's a big claim. I understand it's a big claim, but it's also the central claim of pragmatism.
Let's move it on just a bit, because
Yep.
this is all fascinating stuff.
Yes.
But I do want to talk about the book, which I read, found really interesting, Jordan. 12 Rules for Life. Very
We should probably talk about that. Because, yeah, that's the fundamental divide between him and Sam Harris is there's reality is that which exists outside of people interacting with it. But the reality that we are within, or all of life is within, is how to act within this like reality, and like the actions that we do within the physical reality can affect future reality. Like we have the capability of changing physical reality, even changing our own biological nature and physical form.
Well, so again, this is how atheists arrive at their point of view, and this is how Sam does it too. Pain and suffering exists. It seems to be arbitrary. Gases in a container bounce around arbitrarily. Therefore, all of existence is arbitrary. Therefore, there is no correct. And that's the contention that's occurring right here. That's why she said it's a big leap.
There is no correct for the arbitrary universe, but for the aspects of the universe that are aware of their own behavior, there is a need for what is correct and what is incorrect.
Right. Sort of. Because the final assessment is that there is no true correct. Right? It's just localized within whatever system you're examining. So humans have their correct, and lions have their correct, and solar systems have their correct. And Peterson's saying that's a much deeper principle of the universe, let's say, rather than just a emergent phenomenon that's pretty to look at.
What is it that's the deeper part of the universe, that which selects?
Yeah. Peterson is saying that there's something underlying. That's his God, right? That there's some underlying fundamental force that helps shape the universe by choosing that which is correct. And Harris is just saying, well...
And people have the capability of acting within that force and being a part of that force.
Yeah, but see, even Sam Harris, so once you include free will, you can't really make this argument, essentially, which is why Harris has to dispense with it.
Make what argument?
About enacting the correct behavior in the world.
Oh.
Yeah, because Harris necessarily says it's all randomness. People think they have free will, but they don't really.
Mm-hmm. Well, you could still, let's see, say you were a robot that was programmed to behave in a certain way, and you behave in that way. Yeah, I guess you can't really...
You have to dispense with consciousness, the way I see it, because free will seems to be inherently bound up in consciousness. And this is one major contention I have with the new atheists, is that they admit that consciousness is a mystery, but they summarily dismiss free will for the most part, even though it seems intimately bound up in whatever consciousness is.
Okay. Think of it like a robot that behaves according to algorithms, that can also have algorithms created for it, and but can't create his own new algorithms. Or no, maybe there's algorithms that allow for that as well. And then you're always running off of those algorithms to when you're interacting and making choices in the world.
Right. So I don't think that consciousness is algorithmic.
Yeah, I know. But I think that's kind of the assumed naturalistic perspective. And so, yeah, is there a system of ethics to behave according to if there is no free will? Because all there is are the algorithms that you were born with and you've been raised with and that you've learned across your lifetime.
If that's the case, you have to explain how it's possible to change those algorithms, which isn't done yet.
Yeah. So people that have learned new algorithms can share those with you or force them upon you. Though I don't think there's no real amount of force for new algorithms, but they can show you how these new algorithms will benefit you greater, and then you can adopt them. Or maybe they're like automatically adopted because they fit in place. Because there's no choice in, like, I'm going to now use this new algorithm. It's
Yeah, I'm sorry, what was the question? Uh-oh, beeping. Did your phone die?
Hello?
You there? Yep.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So an algorithm, I've either come to this new algorithm on my own with no amount of choice to it. It's just through blind luck. And now that I have this new algorithm, I can share it with the world and make it so that they also can come to understand this new algorithm and then act according to this better algorithm. And that's ethics. That's a system of ethics without free will, as I understand it, at least. But
how?
I don't know.
You're just saying it, though. You're just saying the words. Right? You're just saying
I know.
hypotheticals.
I'm trying to comprehend ethics without free will, like what you should be doing and what you shouldn't be doing. And that's how people come to act properly. And the only way they can act properly is if they've had new algorithms implanted into them in a way that they're able to understand.
Well, Harris says you don't have free will, and it's all retrospective post-justification analysis, right? Even though that mysterious quality of post-justification analysis, why it exists, right? Why it would ever exist, why it makes more sense to think that versus the total assumed position that everyone has that they do have free will. I don't know how they're getting there, other than the fact that having free will almost certainly collapses significant portions of their argument against God and against some underlying fundamental truth. But we can get stuck here. Let's let him keep going.
Yeah, sure.
Very much drawing actually on your biblical series as well, and that was interesting to me. It's almost like, I don't know, psychological theology or something like that. I'm not sure what term to give it, but you constantly draw throughout it. It's a rule book for helping people to lead meaningful lives.
He doesn't often give tells about what he's thinking.
Stacked with illustrations and stories from biblical stories, Adam and Eve, the flood, Cain and Abel, and so on, and Jesus as well. Why has that particularly been your focus recently, to explain life and psychology from this very religious standpoint?
Well, I wouldn't say recently. I think I've been doing this since about 1985. But the reason, there's multiple reasons. The fundamental reason is because I was trying to solve three problems, I would say. One would be the problem of how to live in the face of the undeniable tragedy of life. The other is what to do with the fact that malevolence exists. And those are the two most fundamental questions. and they're interrelated, because what happens is that the apprehension of tragedy is one of the things that drives people towards malevolence. I have a chapter in there called "Don't Criticize the World Until You Put Your House in Order," and I draw writings there from some of the worst people about whose actions I'm familiar with, like the Columbine High School shooters and mass murderer named Carl Panzram, who's a very insightful person. And I've tried to track how it is that people develop a malevolent attitude towards being, I would say, towards life. And that's intrinsically associated with tragedy. Well, these great stories that we have, part of the substructure of our culture, are antidotes to both malevolence and tragedy. That's what, and I mean that, I'm not necessarily even saying that they're successful antidotes, but the reason that they were formulated, the deep reason, is as a response to the tragic conditions of life and to malevolence. And then my experience in delving into these stories is that the farther I delve into them, the deeper they get, and that never ends. Just when I think I've got to the bottom of a story, like the story of Cain and Abel, which is like 12 sentences long. I mean, it's so short, it's unbelievable. It has no bottom. And that's a really fascinating phenomenon.
Same
I guess it's
happening
partly
in physics,
like the Bible is a hyperlinked text, you know, so that
Mm.
every verse refers to many other verses, and so you never get to the end of it in some sense. But then it's also hyperlinked with the entire culture around it, and then I also think that because the stories in Genesis, especially the first part of Genesis, are deeply mimetic in the sense that you've been describing, that they have a kind of biological depth that's unparalleled as well. Yes, they have a life of their own, that's for sure. A life that lasts a lot longer than the mere lives of mortals, let's say. So,
and the rules all have, you know, quite fun titles in a way. In fact, I think they originally came from a blog post you put up on an internet website, but you've obviously developed them in all kinds of different ways. Stand up straight with your shoulders back. Rule number 2, treat yourself like someone you're responsible for helping. Number 3, make friends with people who want the best for you, and so on. I guess I'd be interested to know what your response, having had a chance to look at the book, is to this way of looking at life and how we create meaning for ourselves in the process.
Is my reaction, if you like. It's so full of lovely stories, really interesting, thought-provoking stories. Wisdom, lots of wisdom all over the place. Then the Bible stories. Then this...
You just don't understand that? You don't get why the Bible is being invoked?
I get it in this sense, that those stories, many of them, are very deep and have something to tell us. But it's the way I think that Jordan kind of slithers from a good idea about this might be a good way to live your life to this story. I mean, let me give you an example. You talk about, with great knowledge about the evolutionary arms race between the size of babies' heads and the size of women's pelvises. And this is something that's always fascinated me. I think it's meme-driven that, we've ended up with childbirth being painful, as I well know, and you probably don't, how painful it is, for those reasons. But then later in the book, you bring in the story of Adam and Eve and how God says, women will suffer and so on. And the implication, not clearly stated, but the implication to the reader is God did it. Now, on the one hand, you're saying, look, we evolved this way. This pain and suffering is an inevitable consequence of the way that evolution has played out. And in the other, you're kind of luring people into believing that God actually made that. And even worse than that, the idea that it at least speaks to me, that somehow we're so bad and deserve all that suffering, which in other places in the book you try and get rid of, that we shouldn't feel so wicked and bad.
How do you respond to that, Jordan?
Well, you asked a little bit earlier about, you were talking about psychological theology, and I did this lecture series on Genesis, 15 lectures on Genesis, and it was called a psychological interpretation of the biblical stories, psychological approach to the biblical stories, I think. And I've been trying to do that. Like, I'm not a theologian, even though I'm very interested in these stories. And what I was trying to do I do believe that the biblical texts are foundational. I believe it in the Nietzschean sense. And, Nietzsche, of course, announced famously in the late 1800s that God was dead. And the typical rationalist atheist regards that as a triumphalist proclamation. But that wasn't that for Nietzsche. And Nietzsche knew perfectly well and said immediately afterward that the consequences of that was going to be bloody catastrophe because everything was going to fall. And he predicted the rise of communism, for example, and the deaths of tens of millions of people in the aftermath of the death of God. Because Nietzsche knew perfectly well that when you pull the cornerstone out from underneath a building, that even though it may stay aloft in midair like a cartoon character that's wandered off a cliff for some period of time, that it will inevitably crumble, and that it will be replaced by something that's perhaps far worse. Now, Nietzsche hoped it would be replaced by man's ability to recreate meaning spontaneously out of his psyche, for example, which I think is a doomed enterprise. But he knew that in the interval, it would be replaced by both nihilism and by communist totalitarianism, which is a hell of a prediction, because it was done like 40 years before the events actually unfolded.
Well, you can see it that way, but if that is the case, why do we have evidence that the most dysfunctional societies today are the most religious? And for example, in the United States of America, the
She's
higher, if
drawing
you go
a
across
single
different states,
correlation here, by the way, which is absurd. A single order correlation, first order, like there's no it's not even close to scientific, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think it's kind of assumed, or that she's referring to, say, like Islam or those types of places.
Let her keep going. Yeah.
the higher belief in God is proclaimed belief in God, whatever you think that means. The more murders, suicide, marital breakdown, various measures of dysfunctional
all
society
of that
are
correlationally to religious production. It's insanity. Like, this is the most obscene statement. It's purely her saying, I'm right. This backs it up. There are so many freakishly difficult pieces to unpack.
You could even put it the other way, where the societies that have a lot more rape, murder, and poor, these types of injustices, that leads people to require some sort of religiosity just to be able to cope with it.
Right, or that they're failing to enact the religion they profess to believe in. There are any number of conclusions you could draw. Like this, yeah.
Well, no. If they are people that are, okay, I see. So there could be the contradiction within people that.
Right. Like you saying, I don't want to eat the cake. I want to eat something healthy.
Mm-hmm.
Right? The ought exists separately from the behavior, let's say.
Yeah. Well, there was Freud's contention that religion was used so that people could have a justifier for their sins. So they could, say, rape, murder, and kill, and then be forgiven by the nearest Catholic church, something like that. That would be, the inner contradiction between what they're professing and how they're acting.
Yeah, that's certainly the case. What seems to be the case, and I think you brought this up before with Haidt, is that people are willing to justify and rationalize after the fact, no matter what.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And that's exactly what she's doing here. She's saying the existence of religion is producing all of this nonsense, and let's let them keep going.
You can see the correlation, but you can't say that it's necessarily been produced by the religiosity itself. It could be just the other way around, where religiosity is necessary just to survive in those types of situations.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it depends on how you define religion, in part. I mean, first of all, America is a very religious country. And to think of it as a country that's doing worse than other countries in the world is just not the case
Well, its
at all.
incarceration rate is higher than any other.
Well, sure, but so is its standard of living and its what would you say, ability to provide the basic essentials of life for people and the essential freedoms that go along with it. You wouldn't compare that to an African dictatorship.
No. But most of these studies have been done only in developed societies. But there, if you look at income inequality, that's much worse in the States. So yes, a lot of people in the States have a very high standard of living, but the poorest are really poor.
Yes, well,
income inequality and incarceration rates. It's just.
I'm pretty sure capitalism's the fault for income inequality, right?
Yeah. This is disingenuous of her. And if she can't see that, then I don't know quite what to say. I see. He has such. Peterson has great patience. If I were sitting in his chair, this is my reaction. Like, are you serious? Are you serious? We're on a national stage here, broadcasting in front of who knows how many people are going to watch this, and this is your argument. It's unbelievable.
And
Good type.
with Obamacare being dismantled and so on.
Well,
but nevertheless, let me go back to that point. We know that more dysfunctional
Forgot
societies
about that.
have higher proclaimed belief, higher attendance in church, and so on. Now, this doesn't fit with what you were saying. Now, Nietzsche's ideas are very profound and interesting, but I just want to stop you from saying that he was absolutely right about somehow if we get rid of God, we're going to be worse, because we have very well-functioning societies
we
in
were
Scandinavia,
pretty
for
bad
example.
in the 20th century.
Oh, we were, yes. People were.
And we could easily drift that way again.
And there've been terrible bad things done in the name of God, and there've been terrible bad things done in the name of communism and atheism. I don't think we can. I don't want to weigh them up.
But you
I'll
just
weigh them
did.
You'll weigh them up and you'll say.
No problem.
But then
Let's
you
give-
have to go against this evidence that
We'll
I've just
give
stated.
Jordan, come back on this evidence. I mean, obviously, from her perspective, Sue feels like actually we've got pretty stable societies that are increasingly secular these days. So perhaps Nietzsche was wrong, and in fact, we're not going to see this
Well,
moral,
I would
moral
say
decay.
they're stable to the degree that they're actually not secular. And this is also a Nietzschean observation, and a Dostoevskian observation for that matter, is that we're living on the corpse of our ancestors, like we always have. That's a very old idea, but that stops being nourishing and starts to become rotten unless you replenish it. And I don't think we are replenishing it. We're in danger of running. We're living on borrowed time and in danger of running out of it. I think that the reason that the Western societies essentially work quite well is because they act out a Judeo-Christian ethic, and one that's essentially predicated on utmost regard for the sovereignty of the individual. So the individual is sovereign in relationship to the state, which is a remarkable idea and one that's fundamentally religious in its essence, in my mode of thinking, and that's also predicated on honest speech. And there's other predicates as well, but those are religious predicates in my estimation.
There's a section actually, Sue, in Jordan's book where he says this: Christianity elevated the individual soul, placing slave and master, commoner and nobleman alike on the same metaphysical footing, rendering them equal before God and the law. It's nothing short of a miracle. He has a very high view of what Christianity has done for the world, whether or not it's objectively true. What do you take from it?
Well, that evidence that I was discussing earlier, that there's plenty of now, that the most dysfunctional societies are also the most believing societies. There are lots of hypotheses about why that is the case. But I would like to challenge Jordan on the implication that he put before, that because a lot of these of our moral stance today comes from religion, and not all of it does, that it has to have that as a basis. I don't think it does. I feel very grateful to live in a country where now, at last, the majority are not religious. It's just tipped over in the latest polls. And in fact, coming up on the train from Devon today, I got chatting with various people. The assumption that I find here, I don't know what it's like in Canada, is I always start with assuming someone's an atheist, and it nearly always turns out to be there. Oh yeah, all that religion stuff, you know. It's very, very common in this country. Now, we have not descended into being a terrible country. We have, yes, we have our problems.
We're still fairly early on in the experiment, I suppose, of ditching God.
Like about 10 years.
Yes, I will await with interest and hope I live long enough to see. But then if we look at many of the Scandinavian countries, which are way ahead of us in that move, they have wonderful health systems, welfare state, support for people out of work, and so on.
I'd be really interested in hearing your response to all this then, Jordan. Ultimately, we can divorce the good principles that we may have had in some respects from religion ultimately, and still leave.
I wonder if there's this thing that always happens where it's always the grass is always greener on the other side. Like I have no way of knowing just how good it is in, say, Sweden or Scandinavia. Or
it's not the heaven they're portraying. I guarantee it. Okay, I've known plenty of people, and look, we talk with someone frequently from those places. Like it's not. Yeah, it's an absurdity because this is exactly what they're doing. They're pointing elsewhere where you have very little data and experience and saying, look, it's so great over there. And that's just not true.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right.
Yes.
perfectly happy secular
Well, it depends.
lives.
See, a lot of this depends on your definition of religion. Like, I know perfectly well from my own empirical studies that there's at least two disparate sets of phenomena that might be regarded as religious, right? There's the dogmatic element, which is really what Sue's referring to when she talks about the pathology of religious belief. And there's the spiritual element. And the dogmatic element tends to appeal to people who are essentially conservative in their temperamental nature. And I mean that scientifically speaking. And the meaningful element, the spiritual element, let's say, tends to appeal to people who are more liberal in their temperamental fundamentals. And religion overall is a continual dialogue between the dogmatic element and the spiritual element. And if either of those exceeds its proper boundaries, then there's a degenerative consequence. Like if the spiritual types get the upper hand, then the structure disappears. And if the dogmatic types get the upper hand, then everything clamps down into too much stasis. So to make a direct claim, say, between the existence of dogmatic belief and the pathology of society, and then to assume that that encompasses the entire relationship between religion and the functioning of society, I think is based upon an unfortunate narrowing of the definition of what constitutes religious. But then back to the idea that our moral claims can be divorced from the religious substrate. It depends on what you mean, and here we go with the definition, by moral substrate, or religious substrate. Let's say that I regard you as a sovereign individual. Well, the question is, what does that mean? It might just be an opinion, might just be a meme, might be reflective of something far deeper, so deep that if we transgress against it, it will be fatal. And my investigations have convinced me that that's exactly the case, that although it may be a rational claim, it may be an enlightenment claim as well, that there's something underneath it that's so much deeper than that, that to reduce it to mere rationality or to mere enlightenment claim is to do it an immense disservice. And also to fall prey, I would say, to the postmodern quandary, because the postmodern quandary is all belief systems are equally invalid. It's something like that. And that's a real problem when you try to erect a belief system on purely rational axioms. So, and you can't, besides that, you can't even do it. It's like, I don't respect you as an individual for rational means. The rationality didn't precede my respect for you. It's way deeper than that. It's embodied, for example. It's built into our emotions and our motivations.
This issue with rationalism and the Enlightenment and so on, where you feel that those who appeal to that as somehow we're in this golden age now, are forgetting that it's all built on a much deeper, longer evolutionary psychological history, which is completely different to rationalism per se.
Yeah, well, I see a university professor. Let's take Dawkins, for example. He's a sovereign, rational individual, but there's a wall around him. That's the wall, let's say, of his university, and then outside the university there's the wall of the town, and outside the town there's the wall of the state and the wall of the country, and there's just these concentric rings that are protecting him, and he can stand in the middle and say, well, I'm divorced from all that. It doesn't undergird me. It's like it undergirds you to a degree that you can't possibly imagine, and you're living on the, well, really it is the resources that have been gathered painfully and bloodily in the past, and saying, well, we can just detach ourselves from that and float off. It's like, no, you can't. You don't understand what you're talking about.
All that leads me to gratitude for all that we have. I mean, I recognize that. I recognize that nothing to do with any religious basis at all. I recognize that I could not come on the train here, have a really interesting...
So she's talking about feelings, right? Gratitude is a feeling. She's not addressing the claim at all about the concentric circles of belief structure that exist around Dawkins. Not at all. Right? So if that entire town and that entire university, let's say, all believed in God and were enacting that belief continuously, and maybe it's not true at the university anymore, let's say, but it's certainly the case for the majority of our civilization in the recent past, then you have to contend with this. You have to understand that is a reality that you're observing and can discuss. But she's sidestepped this. She's slithered out of it by saying, "But I'm grateful. I look at that and I am grateful."
Yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily see Peterson's point as being that great, because these are all concentric circles that were created by humans. And so you could be a humanist and still have that gratitude towards all of the humans that did the types of things, whatever their motivations may have been, whether it was monetary motivations or religious motivations, things like that.
Well,
You could still have the gratitude towards humans.
Yeah, but Peterson's claim is that the belief in God contributed significantly to the behavior that produced these structures, these stable structures. Right? That's his claim. And that's certainly the claim of a lot of people who are behaving in the world, or at least up until recently. Right? So that's what he's saying.
But yeah, but just because something is believed and then it led to an outcome, if there's a way for that outcome to be gained without that necessary same belief, then the belief itself wasn't the thing that did it, you could say. So if, say, in a capitalistic society where people make money because of doing good things, or like creating these concentric circles of security for people, then there's the belief that money is valuable that leads to these types of occurrences that can happen. I think where that breaks down is in corrupt societies where there's people acting out, people acting out of power instead of acting out of competency. Then that's where there's kind of needed to have this Christian ethic. But, well, I don't know, even within, say, the United States, there's a whole swarm of critics of capitalism and the types of behaviors that it still leads to. Because just as like what Marx says, in a completely capitalistic society, the individual is the one that suffers. So there's, even within capitalism, there's that
a certain kind of individual suffers, not all kinds.
Yeah.
Proletariat
so
suffers.
The people at the lowest of the food chain essentially suffer. And then within communistic societies, people throughout, people all over suffer.
That's what it turned out to be, yeah. But Marx also said that that capitalism would lead to the dictatorship of the proletariat. That was the final outcome. That would necessarily take place, and that hasn't happened. And in places where it attempted to happen, it's just truly awful.
All right. So yeah, there's the belief in God that has led to these types of beneficial social safety nets, and well, that it's contributed, but a case could be made that just because it's contributed, there could be new motivations that allow for the same outcomes.
So
instead of the
in
belief
evolutionary
in God.
biology, there are two concepts. There's homologous and analogous adaptations. And homologous adaptations are structures that started out the same but ended up having different functions in the end. A great example of that is the bat wing versus the human arm. Right? And analogous are things that started out different but ended up acquiring the same function over time. So something like the beak of a bird and the teeth of a human. You can have belief which enacts behavior in the world that dictates, by the choosing of the universe, let's say, a certain outcome. And then you can have other beliefs that have the same outcome. Right? So it's quite possible. Let's say it is possible for Dawkins and Harris and Dennett ensconced within their concentric circles to arrive at a well-being of sorts with a different belief structure. The question is whether or not that's possible, or whether it's wise for that to be the predominant view. And if that were the case, whether or not civilization would function properly, right? That's still what's being debated here. You can't just throw it out because one man or a few men happen to have arrived at a well-being that they appreciate or feel gratitude for. There's a larger system to take into account. That's his point, I think. But you can let it go on.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Discussion, meet Justin again, have a nice glass of cool water, without a load of other people doing it for me. That gratitude, which is one of the things that you quite rightly
Yes.
put into your book, it gives good place to it, and it's very important. That doesn't come from anything religious, unless you say because I was brought up a Christian it came from there, but I don't base it on that anymore. I would
What do
like
you think it comes from?
I think it comes from a recognition that I've done a lot of meditation. I've meditated every day for 30 years, and I think this has something to do with it. But it's observing the inner consequences of different ways of confronting the world. And I'm much more in recent years in the habit of waking up in the morning, even if it's raining in January in England, and looking out and going, oh, and it's a feeling of gratitude, not gratitude towards God or towards anybody or anything, just free-floating gratitude. That seems to have a positive consequence. I set the day up better, and it's kind of self-perpetuating. It pops up again and again.
Do you think you can just have gratitude in general, or must gratitude always be given towards something and ultimately
Well,
God?
that's a good question. That goes back to our discussion about acting things out. Like, gratitude is something you feel towards something. And you can say, well, I don't feel it towards anything in particular. And I would say, all right, well, the diffuse nothing that you feel it towards serves in your psychological hierarchy as your equivalent of God.
No, but it's gratitude. This morning, for example, I looked out and it was so green. We've had frosts and it's been white the last few days, and it was green this morning, and it was just gratitude to the universe, if you like. It's not really God because it's not a creator. It's not anything I can pray to. I know.
Why feel gratitude towards it?
I
then?
don't know, but I find
That's
it.
fine.
I know that you tackle in this book that happiness is not an ultimate good, and I
No,
struggle
it's
this right.
just not an ultimate goal.
Oh, okay,
I
all
didn't
right.
say it wasn't an ultimate
All right,
good.
all right, okay.
There's a big difference
yes,
between
you're
those
right,
things.
You're right, you picked me up correctly on that. Nevertheless, we are happiness-seeking creatures, and I have found through practice and growing older that acting gratitude, thinking gratitude, feeling gratitude makes me happier and seems to kind of rub off on other people.
So
I don't
think we are happiness-seeking creatures, and I think it's a low goal. Not because there's something wrong with being happy, because, thank God if you get to be happy now and then. But I don't think that that's what we seek. I think we seek a meaning that's deep enough to sustain us through tragedy. And that is way different.
Do you know, when I hit tragedy is too strong a word, I think, but when horrible things happen to me, or I feel, or I read some terrible thing going on in the world, yes, those are tragedies going on in the world, my response is, nothing matters. It's all empty and meaningless. This is how the world is. Get used to it. Get on with it, girl.
That sounds like a very Zen Buddhist way of dealing
I guess
with
it is.
meaning.
Well, it's a paradoxical way, though.
It
Because
is
the
kind of
first
paradoxical.
The first part of that is nihilistic, and the second part isn't. So how do you reconcile those two things? Why get on with it, girl?
Because, well, here's another thing. I've often done this with my students. Let's suppose you become nihilistic. Nothing matters. There's no point in doing it. I think we live in a pointless universe. What are you going to do? And I say to them, like William James in his wonderful thing about getting up in the morning, but that's a slightly different point that he makes there. But I say to them, okay, tomorrow morning, when you wake up, think it's all pointless. There's no point in doing anything. Now, what are you going to do? Well, actually, you're going to need to go to the loo. You're going to get out of bed and you're going to go to the bathroom. And when you're there, you'll think, actually, I'm hungry. I think I want to go down to the kitchen. I probably should put my slippers on. Why don't I get dressed? You go and have something to eat. And then you think, I'm bored. And you go to university and go into your lectures. And, we are not creatures who will just not do anything. To me, to go through that process, which I've done in the past.
So this is that contradiction between what they believe, or what at least she believes, and how she behaves in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Which is why I have a greater amount of respect for, say, the antinatalists, because they reach the same conclusion as she has, that the universe is meaningless, but they actually build their ethic off of that.
Right.
And try to turn it into a system of how to act according to that conclusion.
Right. Because rationalism will allow you to build that using that assessment that she's made.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's one of the great points that kind of gets glossed over here and should be focused on more frequently. A belief in God from time to time will get you a Spanish Inquisition, let's say, while people attempt to co-opt the structure for their own ends. Right? I highly doubt, if you go back and I do doubt, I strongly doubt that if you go back and examine any of that stuff that is attributed to religious belief, it is almost certainly political in nature, right? It's always some political thing. It's people not following the oughts that they profess to believe in. But if you do profess a lack of, if you do profess a lack of belief in God, you can just as easily end up a Columbine shooter. Right?
Well, there's been Christian Columbine shooters, I think, or not Columbine, but those types of, which, yeah, it seems to be closely. And there's been tons of people that have been trying to.
Okay.
I don't know about tons.
Who has been a Christian Columbine shooter?
There have been
individuals who have claimed that God told them to kill their parents, let's say.
Yeah, those types of.
Okay, those are schizophrenic people and or heavily abused people and or whatever, right? That again, you can't just pick a single data point, the words that they spoke, and then analyze it purely from that. It's the same thing that she was doing before by saying highly religious societies are, degrading, right? It's absurd.
Okay, so the assumption that seems to be made by the new atheists is that even if you are a schizophrenic person like that, you have a way to rationalize your evil deeds based off of your religion that you've been brought up with, such as with Islam or the more barbaric acts within the Bible, things like that.
Yes.
Whereas if you were raised in, let's just say, a secular humanist society, you wouldn't have the ability to reach that rationale.
Oh, really?
You would just.
I can do it right now. I can do it right now.
Yeah, I know. I mean, yeah, without the. Yeah, I mean, we're just talking about antinatalists, but besides that, there's pro-mortalism, which is.
Well, how about pro-aliens? Okay? How about we recognize that human beings are fundamentally flawed and that the rest of the universe probably got it right. And that's why they're not talking to us, and that's why the Drake equation, isn't functioning out, the Fermi paradox, and we should probably kill ourselves off before we spread throughout the entire universe. Now this attitude is already taken hold for us against the environment here on Earth, right? There are plenty of people who
I think
that we're a virus
quite
on
interesting to see the anti-humanists that are within the artificial intelligence community trying to bring about the new evolution, a new stage of evolution past the flawed humans.
Right. And the question is, given a structure, a belief structure, what possible conclusions can you arrive at, and how likely is it that you will arrive at those conclusions? And I, like Peterson, agree that if you dispense with God, you are more likely, given the sum total of different temperaments and population, genetic probability, whatever, to come to the conclusion that you can be a Raskolnikov. Right?
If you're not a cowardly individual, that's the thing. With a morality based off of cowardliness, then
it's not just
you'll be.
It's not just cowardliness, okay? Because Because there are plenty of people that are cowardly and enact these things anyways, kind of like the Columbine shooters, okay? It was cowardly what they did. Cowardly. And killing themselves with cowardly. You can call it that. But what it was is they no longer functioned in the concentric circles that, say, Dawkins had access to. They were ousted. And so it was easy to look at the rest of the structure that was developed without them and want to tear it down. Right, that's all it takes. It doesn't take anything else. It just takes you being, ousted from your surroundings.
Yeah. I mean, that's I think one of the strongest cases made by, like, Dostoevsky, that for the situations where a person is living within hell, be it like they've been ousted from their concentric circles within their small communities, say within schools, or if they're living in, I don't know, a third world country where there are tyrants in rule, then that's where the supernatural religions are most necessary in order to change things. Like, I don't think you can take
You disappeared. Did I lose you?
Hello?
Yep, you're back.
Okay. Yeah. I don't know if you can take secular humanism to, say, the people that are being tyrannized by the warlords in Africa. I don't know if that's something that can function exactly. Or, I don't know. I know within China, Christianity's been widespread through missionaries and things.
Right, and that was essentially my point that I kind of started this all off with, is the position that these new atheists are taking. Is it exportable? Is it truly memeable? Is it exportable? Can they export it to other people? And I'm saying no. Maybe it's possible for them to assemble all the good pieces of all the various religions by looking at the past. And meditation seems to be a big one, right? In Christianity, we call it prayer. Right? It's just a different form of it. Or at least that's the function, it seems to me.
It's like meditation, and just like her gratitude that she was talking about is an undirected prayer. Or not prayer, but that same type of action, just undirected.
Yeah. Right.
All right. So, well, the common response to whether or not something is memeable or able to be taken on by anybody is the response that that's not what they're trying to do. They're trying to ascertain whether or not God actually exists or not. There's no relevance to how society changes because of this fact. And so
the relevance is whether or not it's exportable. That's one relevance.
Well, that's the thing.
If you needed calculus to believe in God, let's say, how many people would believe in God? How many people could believe in God? That's a good way to think of it.
And only through calculus could you believe in God?
Yeah, that's the hypothetical.
Okay.
The question is whether or not something is exportable, right? Something is transferable as a meme to someone else, and then having them enact and behave in the world with that belief structure. Because on the other hand, you're talking about the philosophical idea of the correspondence theory of truth. If I believe in God, is he really out there? Is it a she? Is it a non-gendered thing? Is it distributed throughout all space and time? Or is it just
outside of space and time?
Right. All of those things are questions about what it is. Right? But that's not necessarily what's being discussed here. And if an atheist truly wants to make that claim, let them. It's not possible to confirm or deny. And that's why most scientists end up being agnostic, let's say.
I don't know if that's true.
Yeah. I say, okay, most good scientists. Yeah. There are a lot of very bad scientists, just like there are a lot of very bad professors and
Christians and
everything. Yeah.
All right.
A lot, and it's just natural now.
Yep.
Is a very positive way of living, to accept the meaningless and ultimate emptiness of everything, and accept that this creature here, this thing, this evolved creature just will get on with life.
But you're not accepting the meaninglessness of it, even by going through those actions that you described.
You don't think so?
Not at all, because you're acting as if those things are meaningful.
Yes, I am. I'm
right.
acting
Okay.
as though those things are
You're pretending that they're meaningful?
Pardon?
Are you pretending that they're meaningful?
No, I'm not pretending. My way of putting it would be that those meanings are constructed by myself and others.
They're personal
and they're because
than...
the kind of creatures we are, because of the meme
But they're not
plexes,
constructed.
I'd like to
Hunger isn't constructed. Neither is your desire to use the loo. None of that's constructed.
No. But the fact that there is a loo is part
yes.
of culture.
Yeah. Well, thank God for that.
Yeah.
But see.
Oh, you thank God, would you, for that? Sorry, that's a poor joke.
Well, you see. So imagine this. You have the proximal meanings that you described that are sort of.
Huh?
I said I'd thank John. It's a pun on the
of a priori, right?
Yep.
They're handed to you. You might consider them as needs or drives, although they're not. They're personalities. That's not the right way of conceptualizing them. But then there's the intermingling of all those needs and drives, let's say, and that constitutes a new layer of structure, because it isn't just that you have to eat and that you have to use the washroom and that you have to have something to drink and that you have to be warm enough or cool enough to survive. It's that you have to do all those things at the same time in a situation where you're going to have to propagate that across time, and you're going to have to do it with a bunch of other people, and it's always been like that. And so what that means is that out of those proximal meanings, higher meanings arise. And you might say, well, those meanings are arbitrary, and I would think those are religious meanings.
I wouldn't say they are arbitrary, but I would say they were constructed. It's very interesting. Reading your book...
What do you mean by constructed?
Well, they are a consequence of mimetic evolution, of the language that people are brought up in, the culture they live in, the arguments they have. I mean,
what about the biology that they're given?
Well, we start with the biology and the memes.
Yeah, okay. She just said it. They're a consequence of the mimetic evolution. Now, prior to, let's say, 100 years ago, all mimetic evolution included the belief in God. Right? I mean, like, it's just mind-boggling how they make this leap. I don't understand it. And that's exactly what he just said. She's just ignoring it.
Well, not all the time, because there's been...
not all the time. Not all the time.
Yeah.
But the argument is the successful
I do
aspects
think
of it.
A good case can be made that it's still continually being propagated. Because, I don't know, there's stats on, like, if you're an atheist or not, how many children you're likely to have, and it's like 1.2. Whereas if you're religious, and depending upon your religiosity, then you'll have upwards of 2 to 4 or more even.
Yeah, depending on your branch of Christianity, like you're Mormon or Catholic or
yeah, or Muslim, yeah,
or Quaker. 0.
Yeah, you're always definitely the religious are better breeders than the non-religious.
Well, I didn't mean to imply that it was no longer occurring. I just meant that the substrate upon which all of this has bubbled up, right, is necessarily bound up in all this. And so it's almost as though she's just ignoring all of that. But she's saying it with her words, right? She said it's a consequence of mimetic evolution and genetic evolution. They were agreeing on that earlier. So, like...
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, to think about how the person that you are right now was probably, or maybe not most likely, but quite likely to have been propagated only because along in your ancestry there was this belief in God. And then, especially more so into the future, I'm sure that'll happen even more so, because I see a fundamental conclusion, maybe not fundamental, but a likely conclusion to the lack of belief and to not having children. Bill Maher has this recent clip from his show talking about how I don't know, just kind of railing against people that actually have children. That was kind of telling. But yeah,
It's commonly
Build on
held
top of that.
perspective. Oh yeah, keep going.
okay.
Memes are biology too.
Well, by definition, they are. Well,
See, this is the thing.
I would follow Dawkins in saying, well, talk about genes as biology, talk about memes as culture. That's all I meant by dividing that. But let me say this.
Yeah, but I don't accept that division.
But I want to get back to what we're saying about meaning. Reading your book made me think a lot about what you mean by meaning, and your claim that we should have a meaningful life or strive for a meaningful life, that meaningfulness is important. And I kept asking myself, do I live that way? What meanings does my life have? And, you know, if I think of something like, well, most of my striving goes into writing my books. And is that meaningful? And again, I have the same response when I ask myself that question. It's just what this body does.
Then you should listen to the body and stop listening to the thing that's criticizing it.
And what would the body say?
It would say, write your book and try to be as clear as you possibly
that's
can
what
about
I do. And that's
right,
exactly what I do.
What I said at the beginning is that the atheist types act out a religious structure and
No,
criticize
there's
it.
no religious structure.
Let
We
me
come to
get-
this
let me
big
get-
question
Let me get to
now.
this question, because
Yes,
I
we
did
have.
want to get to this, because
Right.
you have a fascinating part in your book, Jordan, where you do say this. You're simply not addressing atheists. You say you're simply not an atheist in your actions, and it is your actions.
Or
that
if you
most
are, look out.
And it is your actions that most accurately reflect your religious beliefs. What do you mean by that? Why are you saying that no one is really an atheist deep down?
I didn't say no one was.
Okay.
I said that most of the people who claim to be atheists aren't. So this is why I like Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. Because Raskolnikov tried to act like an atheist, right? He took the ideas that were floating around, Dostoevsky took the ideas that were floating around in the late 1800s, which are still the ideas that we're discussing today. One most fundamental idea, I suppose, being after Nietzsche's announcement of the death of God, that if there is no God, then anything is permitted. That was Raskolnikov. Raskolnikov's the criminal in Crime and Punishment, the murderer. He gets away with his murder, technically, but not psychologically. And he decides that if there's no God, anything is permitted.
But
and
this
he can't
doesn't
see
have
a reason.
to be true. That's a person in a character in a novel. I don't think that's so.
Well, let's hear the end of that story. And what
What a strange.
do you take
dismissal to
away
make.
from what Dostoevsky had?
Mm-hmm.
It's like she's not aware of what he was attempting to do in writing the fictional story, and even though he just pointed it out explicitly.
Has to say about.
Well, Dostoevsky's takeaway was that there was a moral law that Raskolnikov was breaking, even though he rationalized his way through it. Like, he committed the perfect murder, right? He murdered a woman who people would have voted to murder, and then he got away with it. And he did it for good reasons, at least reasons that he could rationalize as good. And then he got away with it, but it destroyed his soul. And Dostoevsky's right about that. And one of the things I like about Dostoevsky as compared to Nietzsche, say, because I think Dostoevsky is the profounder of the two, is that in the Brothers Karamazov, for example, Ivan is the atheist, and Ivan is everything you'd want a man to be, like, seriously. And Dostoevsky, man, he doesn't straw man his opponents. The most powerful characters in his books are always the opponents of what he himself believes. And Ivan is always arguing with Alyosha, who's his younger brother, who's a monastic novitiate and really can't articulate himself very well, has nowhere near the force or charisma of Ivan. But Alyosha wins the drama, even though he loses all the arguments. And that's where Dostoevsky is so great. It's like, and this is what you're doing in your life. You're acting out the logos,
All right.
Susan. That's what you're doing. You're writing books to illuminate the world.
Yes.
You say,
And
well, I
that's
don't
not
believe
coming
in
from
that.
a
It's like,
place
yes, you
of
do.
meaninglessness.
Don't you think it's kind of offensive to say to me that I'm not an atheist when I am? Why don't you
Only if you
answer me
choose
this
to be
question? Why
offended.
do you think I don't go around murdering people? Why do you think I go around trying to be?
I don't know you well enough to know.
Yes, I could have done something. You're quite
Often
right,
the
I
reason
could
that
have done-
people don't do it is because they're too cowardly.
Oh, that could be a reason. It could be that I don't know to be.
You
No,
asked
not
the question, lady.
necessarily.
Take it.
No, it's
Well,
a possible one.
It's
All
in
right,
fact
all right.
highly likely at
Yes.
some times in your life
But
if you're a
it's
normal
very-
person.
We're needing to close things out, and
dear,
I
the end already?
know it's we've had not long enough, but Jordan, just come back to this because I want to hear why ultimately, despite everything that Sue said there, you still think she's behaving as though there is, in some sense, a God or some ultimate meaning, even though she protests that no, that's simply
Well, I would
not
say
part of
she's
her worldview.
acting it out. Well, for example, the act of writing a book. I mean, the Judeo-Christian culture is the culture of the book. It's the revelation of the proper mode of being in written form. It's not only that, but it's a large part of that. It's the culture of the book. You're acting out the culture of the book. It's thousands of years old, and the voice, the true voice in the culture of the book is the logos. That's what it is, technically speaking. And so she's acting out the logos and writing a book. It's like, and then she says, "Well, I don't believe in God." It's like, okay, that's
The
fine.
logos, of
Acting
course,
like you do is fine.
in
that will do.
Scripture in the New Testament is
The word.
brought into the Word, and it of course
It's the
relates
word
to
that brings order out
and,
of
and
chaos.
to Jesus Christ as
Yes.
the sort of personification almost of that.
Right. He's the archetypal manifestation of the logos.
I mean,
That's-
these are all big words and things. I mean, a lot of people will be asking, what do you actually make of, in Christian terms, the figure of Jesus? Do you believe that he was in some sense divine? Was there, when you look at what the Bible tells us about Jesus?
Well, one thing you might ask yourself is, do you believe that each individual is divine in some sense? And I would say, well, perhaps not, but you act as though you do. And our law acts as if it does. It's predicated on that idea, because the sovereignty of the individual is the divinity of the individual. There's no difference between those two things. And I can make an absolutely brutally clear case for the development of that idea historically. I've traced it back to Mesopotamia, at least in its earliest written forms. I mean, originally the only real sovereign individuals were the sovereigns, right? The emperors and pharaohs. But that the idea of the sovereign individual descended down the hierarchy of power, so to speak, until with Christianity it was universalized. We're each sovereign individuals, and that means that the law itself
It's
is
such a
written
beautiful idea. I wish they could just see it.
as
It's just so beautiful. It
Well,
really is.
I mean, there's the offshoot of that within secular humanism, where every human is intrinsic because
Yes,
they
right,
are
right.
a holder of consciousness.
But they're simply agreeing with what was already predicated by the Christian faith. And they're trying to come up with another. I mean, did you go and read the Humanist Manifesto 3.0? Right?
I didn't read 3.0. I read the first one, though.
It's like, I don't care how many versions they come up with. If it's anything like structured, like it's so bland and ridiculous.
Mhm.
Right? It's so bland and ridiculous, but it's trying to come to the same, it's trying to develop a system of bullet points to match what has already been determined by Christianity and all of its predecessors.
Well, it's lacking a narrative. So if let's imagine they created some sort of narrative to follow with their manifesto, kind of like you have the actual commandments, and then you have the actual history, say,
Yeah.
of...
Well, the history is what matters. That's the whole point.
Mhm.
And if they adopted the history, then they would be adopting the same narrative. But they can't do that, so they have to dispense with it. It's also why they have to portray history in such a horrible light. I mean, you can look at so many different things from completely different perspectives. You can look at all the terrible things about what happened in the Old Testament, or you can look at the fact that these people survived. They survived in a world that was trying to kill them, that wanted them to be slaves. How did they do it?
Yeah, I think that's what's missing from the secular atheist types, or the humanist types, is they lack a justification for bothering to continue. I mean, you can say that it's ultimately meaningless, and then still behave in the way that goes against that, but you're just cutting yourself off at the knees at being able to argue with people that agree with you on the first part and disagree with you on the second part.
Right. And you see what really matters here, essentially, right? The most animated she gets is when he tells her she thinks something she doesn't want it. Like that's it. That's what really matters. It's whether or not they feel offended. And that's always the case. It's like I hear all of these experts propounding their expert knowledge. I mean, they're all very intelligent people, but they are failing at fundamental levels to understand what's going on because they are missing the mark.
Yeah, that was the same point where Matt Dillahunty like really just completely shut off.
Exactly, it's the exact same place every time. Don't tell me what I think. Maybe. Don't tell me what I feel. You don't know me. It's ridiculous.
Because that's similar to the denying of the sovereignty of the individual. So, like, if you're saying you're not a product of your own rationality and your intellect, you're a product of your own actions and biology and things like that. I don't know.
Well, sovereignty is different than the development of the individual over time, let's say. But it's essentially that what they're feeling is that their autonomy is being restricted by Peterson's claim, right? That they're not getting to decide what they truly believe in. And it's true. You don't. You don't get to believe you're a bird. You don't get to believe you're some 75th different gender. You don't. I'm sorry. There are fundamental limitations. There are physical laws that exist. There are moral laws that exist. There are incredibly complicated structures that are built up from the bottom. And any attempt to control them purely from a top-down perspective almost always ends in catastrophic failure.
If we each contain a spark of divinity. And so then I think, well, what is that divinity? And in the Christian worldview, well, that's the logos. That's the true speech that brings forth habitable and good order from the chaos of potential.
And in your view, whether she likes it or not, Sue is at some level a benefactor of that reality. Of
not a contributor. Not only a much better than merely being a benefactor, an active contributor. It's no easy thing to write a book and to get your thoughts straight and to put them forward into the world.
But she couldn't do it without this idea, in a sense, of God. That
she doesn't need the idea, even. It's embodied. She's acting it out.
One of the consequences of the way I've been thinking about it, and Sam Harris talks about this too, is the way I think about it prevents me going, ooh, I'm so clever, I've written a brilliant book. I mean, it doesn't always. I have those thoughts come up, but I've got quite good at seeing them coming up and going, oh, there comes that thought again. Because I'm taking the view that these books are, the memes are doing it through this organism here. And I have
that
fun.
It's not me, it's the memes.
Oh my god. I love the naturalistic rationale for spiritual embodiment.
Yeah, it's beautiful. We should just let that stand. That's good.
Yeah.
It's manifesting itself.
All right, if you want to
but I'm not playing games. Like, that's the oldest language we have for that sort of thing. And the logos that I'm talking about is the integration of those motivational forces that you were describing. It's not merely a meme. Like, that's where Dawkins is wrong about that. There isn't biology and memes. The interactions matter. They're crucial. Some of these memes are millions of years old.
But you've slipped away, if I can bring you back to Justin's question, really, because you slithered out of it. I think in your question was Jesus different from the rest of us by saying, oh, we've all got a spark of divinity. But do you then believe that Jesus was somehow divine in a sense that other than Peterson. What I am? What was it, did he do miracles? Was he, all of that stuff that makes him...
Quick answer, and then we'll finish with a final question.
Quick answer. How about this? Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and unto God what is God's. That's a miracle. That's the separation of church and state in one sentence. So there's a miracle for you.
We're going to go for a final question. I'm going to ask it for both of you, which is the question we began with. We're talking about the psychology of belief. Do we need God to make sense of life? Your 1 minute answer begins now, Sue.
Absolutely not. That will do for an answer.
Okay. Do we need God to make sense of life, Jordan?
Well, God is what you use to make sense of your life, by definition. This is one of the things I learned from Jung. The highest value you have a hierarchy of values. You have to. Otherwise, you can't act, or you're painfully confused. You have a hierarchy of values. Whatever is at the top of that hierarchy of values serves the function of God for you. Now, it may be a God that you don't believe in, or a God that you can't name, but it doesn't matter, because it's God for you. And what you think about God has very little impact on how God is acting within you, whatever God it is that you happen to be, let's say, following.
It's been fascinating.
So from her perspective, the God that's acting within you is whatever meme that is promulgated through time.
It's not even that. It's like she's incoherent on this. She's incoherent on it. It's what is it? Is it the memes bubbling up from within her, or is it herself? Is it choice? Is it not choice? Like, there's so much incoherence in the way that these arguments are displayed from this side. It's why I can't take them seriously. But it's so true. Your God is the highest motivating factor. Okay, that's the thing that organizes whether or not you eat, whether or not you go to the loo, whether or not you go to university. All of those things have to be organized in a hierarchy. Your God is the one at the very top. And the crucial analysis is whether or not you find that God as your ego, or whether or not it exists somewhere else. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And like,
I mean, it's funny, just the other day I was talking to somebody on Reddit about my how I didn't care for well-being as a system, or at least a naturalistic definer of well-being as the thing that should be, that all our morals should be guided upon. Because if well-being is defined just to the positive feelings within the brain, and to be good is to promulgate the most amount of positive feelings and to create the best subjective experiences for people. The question that I kind of left him with, and he hasn't really responded, was is it morally good to lie to someone so that they feel they become more positive in how their subjective experience, and that lie also benefits them in utility throughout their entire life?
It's a great question.
Yeah, because it pits naturalism against truth. Yep. And so if I don't know how they can square that those two gods away from each other, though. I always imagine that it's going to fall to truth, but that just means they're going to have to come up with a new rationale for a naturalistic well-being, or an objective sense of well-being, if that's the way that they want to determine their morality.
Right. So you go back to the thought experiment that we started with, or that I mentioned at the beginning. What is it that a solely egoistic person can accomplish in this world versus
a solely what?
Egoistic.
Oh.
Someone whose God is themselves. Nietzschean, right? What is it that they can accomplish versus someone and all of the people that agree with them, who believe in something bigger outside themselves? And then when you connect that with the weirdness of reality that we are just beginning to understand and are diving with physics down to the bottom layers, it's all tying together. It's all tying together. This universe has existed forever. This question exists forever. This conversation has been happening forever. You can think of it that way, right? And the only thing that matters is how the behavior responds to the belief. What are you capable of?
To share this time with you both. Thank you so much for being with me on the program. Sue and Jordan, all the very best.
Thanks very much for the invitation.
I've enjoyed it.
Nice talking with you.
All right. It, it
Yeah.
was a good conversation for sure. Especially appreciate the more cordial aspects. Of course, it being only 45 minutes long, leaves a lot more to be desired, especially with how little Susan Blackmore was able to really kind of go into her. But I don't know, even with more time, I doubt she would have been as capable as maybe, say, like Matt Dillahunty was. At least Matt Dillahunty had a little bit better justification than just I don't know. But though at one point during his conversation, he had that same excuse, like I'm allowed to say I don't know to these answers.
Mm-hmm.
But that's kind of the big difference between the theist and the atheist or the anti-theist, or is in the place of I don't know, the theist just places God. So I know what's good because God's written it on my heart. And then the atheist, I've biologically been through the nature of evolution and biology. That's what's imprinted morality upon my heart, or not my heart, but within my intellect, or maybe I've gained it through reason. But the problem is, without some sort of benevolent creator, you may be the byproduct of evil evolution, or or an amoral evolution. So I don't know. There's a lot of different problems, but there's different ways that people go about trying to rationalize behind them or try to fix them within their worldviews.
Right. Well, I think of it kind of like an expanded Cartesian argument for the existence of God, let's say. Descartes' final analysis was that he could build God from realizing that he existed, the I existed. Mm-hmm. And I think it's kind of like that. You know what is true by that which is within you, that which you can apprehend. You cannot apprehend God, right? You can't apprehend it. You can't apprehend all the qualities or the physical existence unless you are a God.
But you can know reality. So if you think that
it hints at something, it hints at a direction, it hints at belief, it hints at a God, right? And then you have these portrayals of what that God is. But to truly know whether or not a God that we have discussed exists, the Almighty, the Omnipotent, you'd have to be that God. You'd have to be omnipotent. You'd have to be omniscient. That's the way I think of it now. Like, that's the eternal question that this universe is posing. And that as consciousness develops over time, that is what it moves towards, is answering that question, attempting to answer it. That's my woohoo ending for the day, let's say.
I don't think I understand it.
So you're inside a box, okay? You're inside the
Yeah.
universe box. And the supernatural, partly, is that which is outside of it. The questions you haven't yet answered. And there are certain kinds of questions, the existential questions, that can only be answered via experience.
But couldn't the box that, like, my universe that I'm residing within is within this larger box of the actual physical universe?
Right, but you're constantly moving and pushing out the boundary. That's the whole idea. And that consciousness seems to be this intelligence that apprehends a choice space and then allows an actor within that choice space to make choices on a system of oughts. And those are variously complicated, but arising from seemingly simple physical laws. Now, we do this forever. This keeps going on forever and ever and ever. This eternal question. And the only way to figure it out is for the consciousness to become what it seeks. That's being and becoming. It's woohoo for most people, I imagine. But it's grounded in physical laws the way that we see them now, I think, and this historical trajectory, and not just humankind, let's say.
Well, that kind of fits to at least how I was reading the first part to the history and origins of consciousness. A lot of it uses the conscious mind and the unconscious, and how the unconscious is kind of that which directs the conscious mind. And so you can kind of think of that either as the universe itself, because there's all these things.
Uh-oh, you broke out. Three, two,
Sorry.
1.
Yeah.
That's pretty good.
Okay. Yeah, you can think of everything outside of our consciousness as what's probably the rest of the universe. And the rest of the universe is continually acting upon us, like all these things that we don't know about, such as our biology from the past. These are things that I have no conscious awareness of, that's still affecting my morality, my behavior, my intuition on things. And you can label that as being God, or you can label that as being the physical world. Of course, it's not even necessarily physical if it's meme propagation, but there's the meme.
There's a spectrum. There's a spectrum of everything, right? When you're born, to go to Neumann, you're without consciousness. You develop it over time, and you become a child. And then you look up to adults, and you have no idea what an adult is. And in fact, it allows you to criticize everything about them. That's the beauty of being a child, is the question, the taboo, through that framework. But then you become an adult, and you realize that you had no idea what it was to be an adult as a child. The only way to realize it is to become an adult. And this is true for everything, it seems. There's an outside perspective and an inside perspective. And the only way to truly know something is to see it from both sides, let's say. Right? To look from the outside, or in the strange inversion of the universe, being locked within your bubble and looking outside the boundary. And then moving towards it, becoming it, and then apprehending it from the inside. That's what consciousness seems to do. You pick a goal, you pick a choice, and you move towards it. And then you understand what happened.
So yeah, there's the two kind of ways of seeing that which guides us unconsciously. You can have the assumption that it's brought about by the naturalistic world, or you can assume it's brought about by the
Well, I don't make a distinction between the two. I don't. I mean, I think it's all natural. I think it's all physical.
So, okay, there's the difference between thinking that it's arising unconsciously or by something singular.
Yeah.
Huh?
Hey, my family just showed up, so I'm gonna go.
Oh,
we're actually leaving. We were just saying hello.
Oh.
Anyway, yeah, that's we're not going to be able to resolve that anyway. So.
No, of course not.
All right. Cool. Talk to you later. You'll have to end the stream. Thank you all for watching or listening, whether you watched live or otherwise. I think next week, I don't know, is the Sam Harris conversation going to be happening soon? I think so.
Yeah, sometime this month.
Yeah, if it happens this week, we'll probably do that. If not, I'm not sure. It'll be a surprise for us and for you guys watching and listening. So,
hoorah.
All right.